while we're getting started. We would love if you want to put in the chat feature, which the chat can be found on your lower toolbar in the Zoom. If you want to sign in, let us know what group you're part of today, and your name and location and role. That'd be great if you feel comfortable doing that. Heidi, welcome. And Ian, welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. I think about 9:01, so we'll give it just a couple of seconds. I want to make sure that we have a good number of our group in. It's also nice to see people are doing some different backgrounds.
Well, thanks everybody for putting this information in the chat. It'd be great if we can just put your face with your name. Some of you may know each other, but I know there are a number of people on the call that I don't know. So if you're willing to put your information in, and we'll just do a quick little round robin so we can put your face with your name and we'll know who we're working with today.
Okay. Let's see here. I think everybody's all right.
Will you be able to do that? There you are.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
Awesome.
I'm not sure. Beth Lynn might not be able to if you're able to mute, you can unmute and say hi, and if not, we'll come back to that a little later, Beth Lynn, okay? There you go. So one of the things that I wanted to acknowledge as we go forward is that take a little more time there. Let's see how you've been feeling. Okay. Mark, you want to end that poll then, Mark, and let's display the results? Or is that the result?
We'll just disappear. There we go.
Or got a couple more seconds here. Are we finished? Everybody finished?
Well, I would think that the first one would be critical, because if you look at all the others, that's what we're aiming at, is improved outcomes for you know, consumers, stakeholders.
So the idea then that the first one kind of takes everything else in and the rest of it is all ways to get to the first one? That's great, Trish. Thank you. Anybody else?
I would think that, I mean, I think all of them are important, but I think in this role that I'm in, especially since I've only been in this role for a year, so I'm still struggling with the system sometimes. That understanding change means changing systems and people in the systems, developing a system focus and how that changes so that we can focus on outcomes, has been something that that really speaks to me and what I'm hoping to gain from this group.
Absolutely, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Dana.
Add on to what Dana was saying.
Yeah, who is that? You?
That's what I was thinking was the same thing, is that we can't operate in, you know, things will never change. We can't just, you know, continue doing business as it's always been done. It's got to change. And so I think, I agree. I think that understanding that and being willing to make those changes at every level of government is really important, and leadership commitment for that. So
Absolutely. That idea of changing people, changing systems, because a lot of the work we do is focused at the system level. But the idea that, you know, changing a system without really focusing on whether or not the people in the system understand the change, are willing to make the change, and are willing to go with you in implementing the change is pretty critical piece of this kind of work. So I see Jamal has his hand raised. Jamal?
So just along the same lines, Dana and Ann, the way that I looked at it is that I wanted to have, you know, the outcomes be family and youth, and you have that realization, and so you get into it, and it's like well, the systems need to change, but in order to change the systems, you have to also be willing to learn from what others are doing, and be willing to share and learn in that process. So to me, it's all integrated, like they're all very important, but to me, it's like looking at the steps to get to what those outcomes, where you want to get with your outcomes. So that's the kind of I've been looking at it, just looking at the screen and what's posted.
Excellent. That's great. Any others?
Yeah, this is Sherry.
Well, I hope that,
I think
yeah, go ahead, Sherry.
The one that really stands out for me is the recognition that we each have something to share and something to learn, because often when I've been in leadership positions and thought that I understood what needed to happen and wanted to just move forward with whatever it was, I was thinking it was really important to step back and realize that all of us have a different perspective, just as you shared with the slide about the elephant. And so that the importance of doing this together with honoring the all of the perspectives is a really important piece of this for me. Absolutely. Thank you, Sherry. And you know, when you're talking about the idea from, you know, state leadership, that's sometimes a particular challenge in terms of something to learn and something to share, because often leaders feel that they have to come out with all the answers. And you know, the idea in leading by convening, one of the things that we really want to point out is this openness to learn. And sometimes it's actually the hardest from a position of leadership, because there is this sense from system leaders that they're expected to know everything. And so we're trying to change that dynamic. We're trying to say that you can't possibly know all you need to know from any one role. The idea of being open to learning, regardless of what your position is quite important. At the same time, the idea that regardless of what your position is, to recognize that you can contribute to leading, and to find your voice and find the ways in which you want to contribute is such an important piece of this work. So let's just, thanks for all your participation on that and your great ideas. Let's just see if we can go a little bit forward here. I don't know, Mark. I hit it, but it's not moving. There it is. Okay, I guess you're right. It was just a little bit of a lag time. So I'm getting some ideas about the kind of things that drew you to leading by convening. And I want to share with you what some of these objectives are. But before we do that, I want to just really be clear about something. That leading by convening, and you know, I know a lot of us have gone to trainings where something is kind of rolled out to you and it is the way you're going to do things. Well, leading by convening is not that kind of program. It is thoughts on ways that we create interaction among people in many roles with many perspectives who have common interests or who are doing shared work. So over the course of about 15 years, we took the lessons that we learned in trying to come together and live this idea to create meaningful interaction among people who were in many roles, who had many perspectives, but had some things in common. And one of those things through the IDA partnership that we focused on was mental health. So using these principles, we created these communities of practice in 18 states, which were very different across those 18 states, but they were all united in the idea that they wanted to be able to think about changing mental health outcomes by engaging a wider variety of people who were potential partners in doing that work. So that's the background on leading by convening. And the objectives of this training are really the basics that in one day that we could cover. I mean, we could make this as lengthy as we wanted to, but today we have to cover some of the basics so that you'll have some foundation as you leave today to take into your work. And the more you stay connected with this, we have some follow-along that you can do some more customization of this work for you. So here's what we're aiming for today. At the end of this day, I want you to be able to describe the value of convening as a core strategy to build engagement. This idea of not just holding a meeting, but truly convening people around an issue as a core strategy and engagement. I want to introduce you to 3 habits of interaction that these stakeholders felt were critical to being able to adopt this way of interacting. I want to be able to talk about, I want you to be able to define the technical, the adaptive, and the operational challenges in convening. So we're going to spend a little time on technical and adaptive and operational this morning. I want you to be able to differentiate stakeholder management from stakeholder engagement. Sometimes people use these as interchangeable terms, but as we're going to explore, they're really quite different. I'm hoping that you'll be able to recognize and differentiate examples of shallow kinds of learning and engagement from deeper kinds of learning and engagement. And I want you to be able to apply some of these leading by convening principles and tools to current problems of practice. And you'll see that as we go through the day. I've tried to take some of the most current things that I hear people talking about and create those as scenarios that we'll use today. So we'll give it a little bit of a lag time here. There it goes. All right. So here's the design. So today we're doing the basics. We're doing the basic principles, the basic outline of this framework, and we're going to do 3 important tools today. So in our follow-up sessions, our 2 hours each, we have 2 groups two groups. You may be in with this group. You may be in with people that are taking this training on Monday. But we're going to do 2 hours each, and we're going to do more tools. And we're going to use those tools to work on practice scenarios that are things that you would find in your work. So I'm going to invite you that if you have a scenario that you'd like to send in for us to use in one of these trainings, please do that. Otherwise, I'll be asking people for scenarios that resonate with them in terms of real work that they have to do, real challenges that they face, and we'll apply these leading by convening tools to those scenarios. So today we're covering 3 tools. If you took a look at the PDF that you got of the Leading by Convening Blueprint, you'll see it's got 21 embedded tools there. So there's plenty of tools for us to spend some time on in these follow-up sessions. After those 2-hour follow-up sessions, we're going to offer monthly peer coaching sessions where you can submit a problem of practice, and people that have gone through the training will be invited to help you generate ideas on how to deal with that in a way that is more engaging, draws on the kinds of things we've been talking about, and allows you as a person who's going to offer advice to practice your skills, but as a person who's seeking advice to practice your skills as well. So we're hoping that that by doing the basics today and then offering these other opportunities for customizing this to your world, to your work, we'll be able to really meet your need for support in adopting some of these practices that we're going to be sharing today. So we'll wait for it to change. There it is. So this morning we're spending this time on this introductions and what the strategy is. We're going to work on authentic engagement and the leading by convening framework and the first habit of interaction coalescing around an issue this morning. We're going to knock off at 11:30, and you'll have a nice long lunch break, and we're going to ask you to be back at 1 so we can continue for the afternoon. Because we're doing one tool this morning, but this afternoon we're going to be doing 2 tools and a demonstration of a third that I think you're really going to like. So I'm waiting for it to move. There it is. So the afternoon session, when we get back together at 1, we're going to take a look at the last 2 habits of interaction, relevant participation, and doing work together. We're going to work on some highly rated tools for each of those, and then before we leave, we're going to talk about measuring engagement and sort of a demonstration of how you can use some of the tools that are in here to really measure progress on engagement from the perspective of your participants, the people that you want to engage, and how that can help you to shape some of your work. Okay, click on the screen.
Make sure to write. Okay, you have control.
I have control? Yeah, I did the clicking there. So, okay. So there are 4 questions that we're going to be able to answer together today, and I'm really emphasizing the fact that we're going to answer these together, because I'll bring you my perspective, I'll bring you my experiences in doing this work, you're going to bring your experiences into this conversation, and we're going to answer these questions together. And I'm bringing this up now because this idea of creating this information together is a really key feature of leading by convening. This idea of co-creating information, that it is not something that's created by a few people and handed out. It's actually co-constructed by our interaction. So everything that we're going to do today is going to be co-constructed, and as we work through these materials and these tools, we're going to answer some of these questions together. So let's just take a minute here and look at the typical definitions of stakeholders. So if you look at a policy text or a typical text in terms of engagement, you know, you see them defining a stakeholder as a person or an organization or a social group or a society at large that has an interest in, can affect or be affected by an issue, a decision, or a policy. Okay, now just think about that for a minute. And some of the key words here are can affect or be affected by. Let's think about that. So what's the difference? We're thinking about stakeholders. What's the difference between a stakeholder engagement around individuals that can affect an action or individuals that can be affected by an action? What's that differentiation there? What does that mean to you? Anybody? Think about that for a second. It really points out some of the ways that we really have to think about our engagement with stakeholders. Anybody want to venture that? Yeah, go ahead, Trish.
Well, I think of in my work where we're helping schools with their student assistance programs, one of the struggles they always have is parent engagement. Mm-hmm. But often what I run into is a rather kind of a us versus them mentality. And so they're making decisions that affect a student, but that affects the family. And they don't really bring them in on the decision making. It's more like, as we recommend they do, but it's more of a, here's our decision, you know, you go take care of it now. And when they don't, they call them resistant. Now that doesn't happen everywhere, but I run into it, and that's
far too common
into my mind.
Yeah. So when we take a look at that, Trish, so that individuals that can affect or be affected by. So when we take a look at this be affected by, it's that idea that what we're doing has an effect on people beyond the group that we're deciding with. There are individuals that are affected by everything that we decide. And in your example, that's a perfect example of individuals that are affected by the discussions and the conversations that we have. So let's take a look at that other one, the other side of that, how those individuals can affect a decision or a policy. So like on the other side of that, Trish, how can the participation of families affect the decision or the policy or the issue that we're working on? What do you think?
Well, I think often of what's going on in that family at the moment, such as this might be a family where it's a single mother or a single parent. They're working 2 jobs. If they come into a meeting at school, they don't get paid. It's not that they have paid time off. Or they don't have the means to get the child to the service that's recommended, or they don't have money or insurance for that, but that's not discussed with them. When that happens, that seems to be when the walls go up, and you know.
Absolutely. So that's perfect. The idea that the walls go up, that's it. The idea that they're a stakeholder that is affected by what we're talking about and what we decide, but they can also affect what we're trying to do. When those walls go up, that affects our ability to actually carry out the decision that we're making. So when we think about stakeholders, part of it is not just that there's some benefit or some loss to them. It's that by their action or inaction, by their cooperation or their lack of cooperation, what we want to have happen is going to be affected. So there's this idea of their interest, and there's this idea of their influence. And both of those together are important aspects of our stakeholder engagement. So let's take a little bit, one more look there. You know, would you say that somebody that has an interest in an area has a different kind of degree than somebody that's affected by a decision that we make? Can we be interested in an issue and maybe not have the same kind of intense engagement as someone who is affected by it? Do we see that in your work? Can somebody have an interest in an issue and not be affected by it, but still be somebody that's interested in it as a stakeholder?
I mean, I would say that it's possible, I guess, but unlikely, because I think our interests come from things that either affect us emotionally or personally some way in our life. We tend to not be interested in something and want to voluntarily spend our time engaging in something that we're not invested in.
Absolutely. So this idea that somebody that has an interest in something may not have the same degree of fervor about something as somebody who's personally affected by it, but there are a wide range of individuals and groups who are interested in the same things that we're interested in. They may not be invited into those conversations. They may not be as central to some of those conversations as some other people, but they have they have some ability to widen that discussion, take it out into their networks, to move some of those issues in ways that when we make that group too narrow, when we define those stakeholders too narrowly, that we kind of shut those people out that can potentially help us in an issue. It's just that they may not be quite as central to the issue as some of the people that we typically invite into our conversations. So that's going to be important as we go on a little later. This idea that people can get involved at varying levels, and our recognition of that is an important piece of defining who our stakeholders are. So I want to go into this next one now, this idea of internal and external stakeholders. You know, this is one that personally bothers me a little bit. When we talk about being in the work with someone, how would you feel if somebody called you an external stakeholder? I mean, it's got a little bit of a feel to it there. But most people do use these terms, and they use those terms to describe internal stakeholders. So if I'm working in the Bureau of Education, I kind of define my internal stakeholders as other people that work there, other people that work on my team, in my division, even in my agency. In mental health, I kind of define it the same way. And everybody else I see as stakeholders, but that I might see them as external to some of my decisions. So leading by convening kind of challenges this idea, because we're saying if we recognize that a stakeholder can vary in their centrality to the particular issue, they still can be affected by what we decide, and they can affect what we decide. So this idea of, in a leading by convening framework, the idea of being internal or external into an issue is understandable in the way people talk about it. But in terms of thinking about stakeholders, it's important that we really begin to think about them all, not just classifying them as internal or external, but in thinking about how central they are to that issue and in what ways their interest in the issue or whether they are affected by the issue can shape the ways in which they participate. Okay? So let's do this poll and let's just see what you think about this. So here's the scenario. Just a quick little scenario. A new system of care initiative intends to start out by inviting their stakeholders into their work. Which of the following groups, community-based system of care, okay? Which of the following groups would be important stakeholders? So let's see what you think. And Mark, they can choose all that apply, right?
That is correct.
Okay, choose all that apply. Let's see what we get. How much time do we have left? Oh, okay, so people are still participating. Okay, let's continue to participate, and let's see if we can get up to, I think we have, the highest number we have is 11. So I think we have 16 people on the line. Let's get everybody to weigh in on this, okay?
We have 13 on the line. So
Oh, 13 on the line. Okay, great.
I think this is probably pretty good to pull it now.
Okay, let's pull it now. So let's take a look at what people said. So a new system of care project is getting started, and 100% of the people said county agencies and families, right? So 100%, everybody sees that as being important. And all the rest are varying degrees. You know, all of them are fairly important, but some are judged to be less critical than others. So I don't know, let's take a look at some of this. So the idea of clergy and justice, anybody want to weigh in on that as to why they might be, you know, not as central as the families and the county agencies when we're trying to create a system of care? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
I'm not so sure they're not central, that they're,
Yeah.
when you think, I looked immediately, well, part of the reason is, you know, my husband's a minister, and I look at that, and we often joke about how they're left out of the decisions, but they're one of the first groups called on in an emergency as far as faith-based organizations can provide this.
Absolutely.
You know, but I am involved in some communities where the schools have done a great job of integrating them in an appropriate way. So they're called on a lot. So why wouldn't they be part of the decision making? I look at all these groups and think they all have a role in the decision making if you're talking about a system.
So I put this one up there, Trish. I think you're exactly right, because I put this one up there, and Mark and I decided that we should let people check all that applied. And you know, one of the things that as we talked about that, I said, well, it's going to be interesting to see that if it's not 100% all the way down, to see what that mix is. And you see that from the list that's here, and clearly any one of those groups, every group on there, you could identify a role that they might play in a system of care. And just as Trish said, you know, using the clergy example, they're often, you know, we often end up reaching out to them in a system of care. And if you take all the ones there that have not been, you know, chosen as 100%, we can imagine ourselves reaching out to them. Yet, when we really think about bringing everybody together, sometimes it looks like so many perspectives to try to meld together that we go with the ones that we know most, you know, that we know most often, that we're most comfortable with to get started. And in some ways that, you know, in some ways that's reassuring that, you know, you can make some progress. But in other ways, the idea of not inviting people in from the beginning, at least in one of these different degrees of participation, does limit us in terms of creating those relationships. So thank you, Trish, for that. That was an excellent example. I couldn't have picked a better one. Fantastic. So let's take a look at this. And the reason why I did that, and the reason why I put that poll up is for the very next. Do I have control there, Mark? There it is. Is for this very next slide, because I wanted to take you back to the system of care principles. And there are a number of system of care principles. These are only two of the system of care principles. And we're all familiar with that first one, that idea of family-driven and youth-guided, with the strengths of the child and the family determining the types and the mix of services that are provided. We're all familiar with that. We talk about that. We go back to it time and time again. But let's take a look at this next one. And it is equally a system of care principle. The idea that the community, that system of care is community-based, with services and system management resting within a supportive infrastructure of processes and relationships at the local level. And so while we really are, committed to that first one, are we also as committed to that second one? And that's really where I'd like you to think about leading by convening coming in, because leading by convening is about developing that stakeholder relationship that is envisioned here in this system of care principle. Okay, so let's go on to that next one, and let's get started and see what you think about this next one. All right, so let's define that stakeholder relationship. So if we have stakeholders in the center, and we're defining what that relationship looks like. What does a relationship with our key stakeholders, these community-based efforts nested in a series of relationships, what do those relationships look like? What characterizes those relationships? So, Mark, if you want to bring up that next poll, let's take a look. So I put 10 descriptors here of what a stakeholder relationship would look like. So let's bring up the poll, and let's have you describe, pick three, any three that resonate with you, that you think describes the stakeholder relationship. What is the stakeholder relationship? Have most people voted now, Mark?
I think so. Yep, I think we're good. Let me just give it another about 5 or 6 seconds.
Okay.
Okay. And pull and share.
All right. So let's see what people said. So look at the top rated here. Trustworthy, open, supportive. All right, so let's just take a couple of ideas here on. So what would you see if you saw a trustworthy relationship with your stakeholders? What characterizes that for you? What brings that to mind? What kind of interactions would you see? Somebody want to start on that one? That one seemed to be highly selected. All of these were highly selected.
I would think if you're looking at a stakeholder relationship that's trustworthy, you would know that you are able to have conversations and interactions with them that were non-judgmental and stayed within your group, that if the trust isn't there, you're not able to move into the other areas of having a supportive relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this idea of trustworthiness is the way that Dana describes it, sort of the key to getting to those other two, to be able to be open, to be able to be supportive. You have to have a sense of trustworthiness. So think about this idea of trustworthiness and how we develop trustworthiness, because this is another key aspect of leading by convening. Trustworthiness is not developed overnight. It's regular interaction with people. It's deeper interactions with people. It's not just a series of. It's not just a meeting every now and then. It's actually having regular interaction with them. It's actually asking them to participate in things. It's finding out what they think about things. Trustworthiness comes from actually doing things with people. Absolutely. So let's take a look at some of the ones that are that were not as highly selected? Is there somebody that really, chose one that maybe isn't one of the ones that's in orange, but you feel pretty strongly about it? Anybody want to tell us about one that they chose that was not highly identified? We see a lot of them that were chosen by a few people, and they must mean something to them. So could I ask one of you to unmute and just tell us what you had in mind when you thought that this particular descriptor conveyed what a stakeholder relationship should be?
This is Mark. I didn't vote, but I think the one thing that I can really appreciate in one of the descriptors was the idea of being candid. Because for me, being candid and trustworthy almost kind of go hand in hand. Because being candid is being hopefully honest and kind of putting things out there. And I think and putting things out there without hiding too much behind what you're trying to say. So I think for me, that's one, even though it's probably a more minimal one that was responded to, I think for me, it's also a very important one.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's great, Mark. Okay, so anybody else want to weigh in on that before we leave that? So we're saying that from this group, and this will be interesting to see what the group on Monday thinks, but from this group, trustworthy, open, and what is that third one? Is the way that supportive are the things that this group defines as critical to a stakeholder relationship. So one of the things that we'll be able to do in the follow-up activities is give back to you what the difference is between the two groups. How is the group on Monday defining this stakeholder relationship, and what kind of interchange did they have around the reasons for their choices? Okay, so when we talk about engagement, and engagement is a word that we use these words, participation and engagement, we kind of use them interchangeably. We throw them around a lot. Terms like engagement, collaboration, it's all through our talk, but what do we really mean when we're saying that? So leading by convening, we're asking you to think about engagement as strategy. And when we say it's strategy, we mean that you can change outcomes by engagement, which seems like kind of a soft, squishy way of doing things, in ways that much harder, much more structured ways fail to make a difference. Engagement, when we truly engage people and they open up their own practice and they open up their own networks to help us move practice, can really make a difference. And so one of the things that we're trying to promote is this idea that engagement is strategy. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's not just a check off that's a requirement for something that you have to do. It's not PR. It's not the idea of being able to showcase something to prove that you're engaging people. It's thinking of engagement as one of the most strategic ways to actually get things to change, and more important than change, sustain. And all of us, you know, there's not an investment that's out there that doesn't have sustainability as one of its core requirements, and yet engagement is so often overlooked as the way to build in sustainability. So what we're going to be thinking about here today is stakeholders as allies. We're talking about new habits of interaction that will help us to create engagement. We're talking about convening as a discipline that has a set of skills, a set of competencies that are teachable and learnable. Because if it's not teachable and learnable, how can we expect you to really become a person who takes engagement and convening into your own personal practice? And one of the things that we're talking about doing in terms of thinking about engagement of strategy is to translate ways that many people can participate in your work. And that's one of the things that I hope we'll be able to leave you with today. So let me see if I can move that screen. That worked real well. Thank you, Mark. So this is the point at which I want to introduce you to the blueprint. You saw if you've had time to take a look at some of the things that were sent to you, you're already familiar with this. But leading by convening is entirely stakeholder developed. This work was done over 15 years by an enormous amount of stakeholders who came together over issues that they cared about. So if you take a look, if you go through the blueprint that was sent to you, that PDF that was sent to you, somewhere around in the middle, you'll see all the list of stakeholders and stakeholder groups that contributed to the development of this blueprint, of this leading by convening framework. And it's different. We say that leading by convening is different than almost anything else because every word of it is written by stakeholders. And they're writing it because of what they've learned in coming together around something that they cared about. And they're coming together with people from diverse perspectives. So in many ways, it models reality because that's what people have to do in reality. They have got to come together with people that may not share their perspective to come to some consensus around the things that they care about. So leading by convening, the top level are what we call habits of interaction. And this comes from a theory base, and I'll share that with you. The second level is also a theory base and an experiential base. And these are elements of interaction. So for every habit of interaction, there is an adaptive and a technical and an operational side. Every one of them, every habit can be thought about from the technical, the adaptive, or the operational side. We'll spend a little time talking about that as well. But as we went through this work, it was really clear to the stakeholders that a major piece of this work was helping people to understand shallow engagement from deep engagement. And, you know, one of the things that Jamal had in your invitation to this session was the idea expressed by these stakeholders that everybody thinks they're a pretty good collaborator. But when you ask somebody else how they felt about that collaboration, you often don't get the same story. So sometimes we're not too good at judging how open we are to actually involving people deeply. And the stakeholders really felt that that was a piece of this framework that really had to be addressed. And so you'll see this in as we go forward. So one of the things that we'll get back into this, I'm just sharing a little bit of we'll go through this part quickly so we can get into some of the tools then. The ideas behind leading by convening are that if we're going to develop these habits of interaction, they have to be supported by this understanding that there's elements of interaction that support developing those habits. In other words, things that we think about time and time again and be aware of so that those habits get stronger. And then there's this depth of interaction, this awareness and this willingness to really engage people going forward. So let's take a look at what some of this looks like. So the first thing that the theory base behind these habits of interaction is communities of practice, Etienne Wenger. So that's really the base for this kind of work, these three habits of interaction: coalescing around the issues, ensuring relevant participation, and doing work together. So that's the source of this piece of the framework. The next piece of the framework are the elements of interaction, and this is the first two pieces there are also a theory base, and that comes from Heifetz and Linsky, Harvard School of Government, and their work in this idea of the technical and the human side of issues is really where we really start to focus on in leading by convening. So this is the second part of the framework, comes from Heifetz and Linsky and their book, Leadership on the Line. The third piece of that, these operational decisions, things that we think about when we're involved in this work, those operational decisions, that comes from the experience base of these partners. And those partners were telling us what we should be paying attention to. In other words, when it comes to you're thinking about engaging people, you're thinking about the technical things that you have to work with and the things that you have to do. You're thinking about the adaptive, the way that people are drawn to this issue, the way that they might be either supportive or resistant to the issue. That's the adaptive side of it. The operational decisions, after you've thought about both of those things, what do you decide to do? And what are you going to pay attention to in the way that you decide to do your work? Those are the operational decisions. Oops, let's go back there. Yeah. The third layer of that framework is the depth of interaction. And this is, again, defined by the stakeholders, defined by these stakeholders that worked together over all these years on leading by convening. And the way that they described these things, where they identified what they thought would be 4 levels of interaction. First level is informing, and that's characterized by sharing or disseminating. It's one way. I'm telling you something, I'm giving you something, I'm instructing you in something. That second level then is what we call networking. There's an exchange. I'm telling you something, you're telling me something back. We may not do anything beyond that, but there's an exchange. It's a little bit deeper than just telling you something. That third level then is where we really make this shift to doing work together, the collaboration level. And what they identified that as was engaging, working together over time. And notice here the idea of working together over time. It's not just this episodic, I invite you in on this and then I don't see you or do anything with you for a year. It's that we're regularly knowing what each other thinks, what each other is willing to do. We're starting to work together over time. And that last level, that highest level, they called transforming. And in transforming, they talked about this idea that you're making a commitment that this will be the way that you do your work. The idea that you're making a commitment to engaging and building consensus, and you do it so often that it becomes the way that you do your work. So that is the leading by convening, the habits of interaction, supported by elements of interaction, depth of interaction, and all around it, a set of tools that these stakeholders have actually used and put together into tools to share with you some of the ways that they came about solving and coming together around problems of practice. So that is that's the framework. And coming out of that framework is one really foundational principle. And we talked about it when we first started. This idea that everybody is a leader and everybody is a learner. And when we think about everybody being able to be both a leader and a learner, some of that we covered when we first started, that it means really 2 things. It means that leaders, system leaders, need to really understand that they have things to learn from the stakeholders, but it also means that the stakeholders understand and believe that they can be leaders in the system. And for our community partners, it means that in a 2-way kind of relationship, that they see the work that we're doing as an interest in their work, and that we see them as having an interest in the work that we want to do. And sometimes that part needs a little bit of translation. You could see that in the way that people identified some groups clearly as being foundational to a system of care, and other groups maybe not so much. Still important, but maybe not as critical as other groups. So this idea that everybody can be a leader and everybody can be a learner is a foundation principle of this work that we really want to kind of keep an eye on and ask ourselves throughout the rest of the day, you know, how the work that we're doing and the ways that we're talking about this really enable people to perform in both of those roles. So, okay, so the first thing we're going to do here is talk about this first level, the first habit of interaction, coalescing around an issue. So as you see, we're right here on this framework. That means that we're going to focus on this issue. We're going to take a look at all the things that are underneath it, because every one of these habits also is supported by everything that's underneath it here. Let's continue. So, oops, one back. So the elements of interaction, as you saw on that framework, are identified as technical, adaptive, and operational. So the simple way to think about that is technical is what you do, the adaptive is how you do it, and the operational involves the decisions you make as you on your way toward accomplishing a task. So if we think about this, one of the things we need to think about is what's the difference between the technical and the adaptive side. So just take a look at this for a minute. One side is the technical side, the other is the adaptive side. And the way I've described it is that the technical is the process side. And if you think about this, the technical, you know, it's often the description that is used to talk about the technical side is that the technical side, there's a way to find a right answer. You can get to a right answer. There's an answer about how to carry out an evidence-based best practice. There's an answer about how you should behave in terms of the regulations that guide your work. There's an answer to how you should use particular protocols or how a manual should be able to guide you in adopting a particular practice. You can turn to expert knowledge and you can answer your questions that are on the technical side. So let's go over to this adaptive side now, which is a little bit different. On the adaptive side, we're talking about the human side of the issue. And when we talk about the human side of the issue, it's a lot more complicated. It changes over time. It's not as predictable as it is on the technical side. On the human side, we're not talking about expert knowledge. We're talking about practice knowledge, what people know from doing the work. We're talking about lived experience, what consumers know about the work that we're doing based on being supposedly the intended beneficiaries of this work. We're talking about informal processes. We're talking about, rather than being governed by regulation and guidance, when we're talking about the adaptive side, we're talking about what people know, how they communicate to us what they need, and how we communicate to them what this is about. We're talking more, rather than talking about experts, we're talking about influencers. Who has influence over the changes that needed to be made? Who can open up networks so that people are more open to think about the changes that we're proposing? And the technical and the adaptive side can work together. Think about the idea of an evidence-based practice. We may have the technical knowledge on how to do the practice, what the practice is, how that practice should be implemented, how we should check on fidelity of that practice. What we don't know is, are the people in that particular setting we're trying to implement something, are they open to thinking about a new practice? Do they have so much going on that it's not the right time to introduce a new practice? Are they in support of even changing from their current practice? These are the things that are on the human side, and where this idea of looking at influencers, understanding the problem from their perspective, creating dialogue, building consensus, comes in to this particular kind of work. So when we're looking at these issues, we're looking at issues that have both a technical and an adaptive side. And everything that we do has both of those sides. In fact, in Leading by Convening, there's a tool called Problems Come Bundled. And in that tool, it helps you to think about what's the technical and what's the adaptive side of a number of issues that you face. So let me just ask you here, what do you think? What do you think that in your experience we're better at? Are we better at the technical side or are we better at the adaptive side? What do you think from your experience that we rely more on? Anybody want to take a venture a guess there?
Joanne, I would say that we rely more on the technical side when we're trying to move towards a problem solution, that often we forget about the adaptive side.
Yeah, absolutely. In so many cases, we're more comfortable with the technical side than we are with the adaptive side. And that's really what this set of tools, this set of skills is all about. It's to try to make us as comfortable with the human side as we are with the technical side. And when you think about what gets in the way, when you see these plans, often you see the plans that are really well articulated, they're well thought out, but yet the change does not happen. So when you see that, what do you think is very often the reason why well planned out and well articulated designs fall by the way? What do you think happens? What's the reason for something like that in your experience?
This is Mark. I think
Oh, go ahead.
for me, I think one of it could be the fact that when we think about the technical approach and everything else, there's the belief that the answer is there, the process is there, and as long as everybody goes by the manual and by the process and checks off the boxes in a very technical way, it'll move forward. The adaptive piece is really where we run into the challenge, because when we think about the technical, it doesn't always account for the unknowns, the ifs, the whatabouts, I'm not buying into this because you haven't included me. So I think that's where, for me, that's where it falls apart. Is it can be the greatest plan in the world, but you haven't. It doesn't adapt to the lack of buy-in, the lack of knowledge, or the lack of the right person at the table.
Absolutely. So I see that Heidi's saying, absolutely, Mark. I mean, that idea that the best laid plans fall apart when we don't understand that it's got to be responsive to the conditions that people bring to that work. Do they believe that there's even a problem? Have we taken the time to actually even think with them about whether or not they define this issue as a problem? How much time are we spending preparing that for that kind of discussion with individuals that we expect to make a change? I'm sorry, but let me see if I can get Heidi's back up on the screen here. Heidi said, Heidi said that oftentimes the people who are coming up with the procedures are not the people that are putting it into practice. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what we're talking about here. This idea that we're so much more comfortable with the technical side. It's what we learn how to do in our courses. It's what we learn how to do even in leadership. Up until very recently, that's really what leadership classes were about. Learning how to create those kind of plans, how to monitor the implementation of things. Very few courses really talked about, and very few systems really focused on this human side until very recently. Now, thankfully, it's really changing because people are starting to understand that this human side of this work is often what trips up the best plans. So that's why these operational decisions are important, because the operational decisions when you're thinking about a plan, it asks us to, when you're thinking about a plan, you're laying that plan out, you're looking ahead at what you expect to happen, you can see a few key places that you really better be paying attention to whether or not the stakeholders are with you. And that's what these operational decisions are about. The idea that you're identifying a few places that where attending to engagement will make a difference. You're thinking about what it looks like, what the behavior looks like at those particular situations. You're thinking about it from the perspective of those that are the intended beneficiaries. So if you're trying to change a practice in, let's say, in a county human service agency, you're thinking about it from the perspective of the people that have to implement the practice, just as Heidi said. And you're thinking about things, behaviors that you can change. So that if you modify your behavior, you modify your interaction, you can make that change to make it more likely that this engagement is going to happen. And when you take a look at those two pieces that we just talked about, the operational decisions and the levels of engagement, then you can create a rubric that allows you to actually manage and assess your level of engagement. So throughout Leading by Convening, you're going to see these rubrics that will allow you to really think about measuring engagement. In fact, the very last thing we'll do today is run through a tool that will allow you to do that. So let's just think about this idea that these behaviors are observable. If we're talking about the depth of interaction as a key place in which we can make a difference, what would we be thinking? I told you about the idea that the stakeholders identified these 4 levels of interaction. But in your experience, what do you think you'd see? What would you experience? If you're experiencing the information level, the informing level, what are you seeing people doing? What would you say? What would you see people doing if they're at the informing level? Think about some of the experiences that you've had that you think are low interaction. What happened in those experiences? Anybody want to share?
From my experience, it tends to be very chaotic. Information is being shared, but questions aren't being answered. People aren't really understanding what is being shared. So the things tend to be a little chaotic, and no one really knows what's going on.
Absolutely. Now you see that from the perspective of the person who is in the intended beneficiary, let's say you, Jamal. And from your perspective, it feels chaotic. It feels like it's not clear. And now think about it from the perspective of a person that prepared a well-developed set of talking points, all right? And they deliver those talking points. From their perspective, they think they met the criteria. But when you actually think about it from the perspective of the individuals who are receiving the information, it's a very different story. So the idea of informing is that we're helping people to recognize that when the only thing you're doing is sharing one-way information out, you are at the lowest level of engagement. So I saw that we had somebody in the chat here. Yeah, Beth Lynn said, yeah, absolutely. She's confirming what Jamal said, that from the experience of the person that's receiving the information, it's overwhelming. And yet when you compare that with the person that's delivering the information, they often think they're doing a pretty good job, right? So this mismatch between what the person who is the system leader and the person that is the intended beneficiary of that information, it's a complete mismatch between across their interactions. And that's why the stakeholders put this at the lowest level of interaction, okay? All right, let's take a look at this next one pretty quickly here. Exchange. Now, you probably know this one. It's a two-way exchange, but the key piece that the stakeholders wanted to communicate in this one is it's just an exchange, all right? Not beyond an exchange. So have you had an experience? Have you had an experience where there was an exchange? And beyond that, you didn't know what happened with the information you gave. Is that a situation that you're familiar with? Anybody want to share? I mean, you don't have to name the people or the situation, but, you know, is that an experience that you've had?
I think about that now with some of the work I'm doing with schools around mental health, and they want to engage in networking. And I think when I think networking, I'm actually thinking collaborating. So this has been like, this is going to change my language. Because one of the frustrations I've had is they actually do the networking piece of this. Their information goes back and forth and they share it and they both talk about how fabulous it is. And then a month later, they come to me asking how they can accomplish the same thing that we just spent 2 hours networking on the month before. And I didn't, like, I guess I'm waiting for the learning piece from that. So I think I just need to change my language in my head, because what I have considered networking really is collaborating. And so that has been, this is eye-opening for me today.
Yeah, this is what the story that you just told is exactly what these stakeholders said over the years that we developed this leading by convening. They kept telling the same story, that I'm asked for information, but it never goes anywhere. It's created the expectation that something's going to happen, but it never happens. I felt like that they heard me, and I expected that something was going to come out of it, and nothing ever came out of it, you know? So the story you're telling is exactly what these stakeholders told over and over and over again. So much so that they gave it this name. They gave it this name for this too common practice of asking people what they think and not going beyond that, right? This idea that we think having the conversation is it, having the meeting is it, and that's actually just the beginning of it, you know? It comes later, after that initial start. So it's better than just giving people the information, but it surely is still a pretty low level of engagement, right? So let's hop over to the one that most people think about, and I think that the way you captured this, that when people think about networking, they're really talking about collaborating. And this idea of collaboration is about creating something that you're going to do together. That it doesn't necessarily have to be complex. It might mean following up with something. It might mean identifying some kind of shared work that people might want to engage in. It might be opening opportunities to participate in something that's already happening to a group that you've just become aware of, that they care about that. But this idea of collaborating is the beginning of an engagement over time. It's clear to the people that are in the conversation that something is going to come of this. It's not just go into the meeting, everybody sounding off, everybody goes home. There's something that comes out of it. And the experience that you just talked about is very, very common to the experience of the stakeholders that wrote Leading by Convening. So let me stop for a minute here, and let me just ask you to think about for a minute and tell me one thing. I ask you to just volunteer here. Tell me one thing that gives you the sense that something is going to come of this. When you're in a setting with a potential partner, that something's going to come of it, that there's really some intent for you to work together over time on something, that it's more than just talking. So can you tell me, just give me something that you look for to tell you that something's going to come of it? Anybody that wants to weigh in on that?
I can speak to this.
Yeah, sure, Katie, go ahead.
So in my role as systems integration facilitator, I lead interagency team meetings. And one of the things that comes out of every meeting that I have are action steps. And so in my role, I also provide the follow-up. So, you know, if there's an action step, I often have to reach out to whoever was identified as the person who has to complete that action step, make sure it's been completed, and then also follow up with a team in its entirety and, you know, let them know whether it was done, what the barriers are to getting it accomplished, and then maybe even reconvening to help the team work towards getting whatever those action steps that haven't been accomplished completed.
Oh, that's perfect. Absolutely. So because the idea there is that you're not leaving that conversation with some, you know, abstract idea of what might happen. You've actually put some things in place. And I saw that we had something in the chat. Let's see I had it here for a minute. Beth Lynn, she certainly validated exactly what you said. She's looking for an action plan as well. And we see that Kate put down that what she's looking for is direct action steps, direct next steps. So many of the people that have offered something here are talking about the same thing. They're looking for something concrete. And one of the things that we try to do in a big group, now if you're in a planning committee or something, more of a formal action plan is probably what you're looking for, a concrete statement in the notes of next step. What happens in a big meeting? What do you do in a big meeting? And, you know, we don't know how long it's going to be until we ever have any big meetings again. But in a big meeting, it's you know, sometimes it's a little difficult to get to that degree of formality. But one of the things that we try to do is put these ideas around the room on a flip chart with concrete ideas that somebody thinks that we should be doing this, somebody thinks that we should be doing that, somebody else, and you put them around the room, and at the break, you ask people to sign up. And those people then hold calls to define that next step, that you let them volunteer for on a sign up. And, you know, honestly, just having the sign ups around the room with numbers with people's names on them in itself creates some momentum, some action there. But the idea is it's often hard to get to that point in a big meeting, but you can at least take that first step. Get people who are interested in kind of defining that to sign up on flip charts along the wall, and then hold calls with those people to try to get to the point of this more direct next step plan. So you're leaving the people with the idea, and it's very concrete, it's right in front of them, that something is going to happen after that meeting, and they have the option to volunteer for the level of participation that feels right to them. They can just get the notes and join in then, or they can be active and take an active part. So we're responding here to that idea that all stakeholders are not the same. Some people want to be right in there because they are, as we saw in that definition, either affected by the decisions that are going to be made, or they have already taken a position and they are going to affect whether you're able to move forward with that situation or not. People that are in those situations have a different degree of often have a different degree of participation, at least in the beginning, than people who just have an interest in the issue. They're interested in it. They see how it's connected to some of their work, but they may be a little bit slower in coming along. And you want options for those people to participate. And creating some voluntary strategies like that is a really great way to do it. So let's take a look at this transforming aspect here. This is the deepest level. And the stakeholders define that as demonstrating by your behavior that you are committed to engagement and consensus building, and that you're doing this over time. You do it so often that it actually becomes the way you do your work, that it's so automatic that you wouldn't think about undertaking a new issue without asking yourself, who else cares about this issue? It would be second nature to you. That's what they are describing as this last and deepest level of engagement, transforming. Often not easy to get there, especially if you're not you can't affect the whole system you're in, but you can move it slightly in that direction. So if I were saying that a system was transformed, tell me, when you picture what a transformed system looks like, give me a couple words that describe what you see there. What are you going to see? How are people acting in a transformed system? What are they avoiding in a transformed system? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
I think they're avoiding hearing, maybe they get to the point in the collaborating where maybe it's a combination, like halfway between networking and collaborating, where they hear what stakeholders, they think they hear what stakeholders want or need out of the situation. So they develop an action plan, but they never go back or even before the action plan, they don't check for understanding. Is this what you meant? Do I have this right? Or a trial that comes back and said, did this work for you? Again, thinking about when parents, when their teams think they're collaborating with the parent, and so they develop an action plan and they put it in place and say, okay, we're done with that student, we can move on. And no one ever picks up the phone and calls the parent and said, did that work? Or was this even before that, again, do you think this plan is workable for you and your child? So that's what you want to avoid, would be that.
Absolutely. That's the kind of thing that transformed systems avoid. They in a transformed system, it would be recognized. If somebody in the system behaved that way, other people in the system would be coaching them. We don't do that here, right? That's a transformed system. That's a great negative example of what a transformed system would do. Anybody want to give us a positive system of what a positive example of what a transformed system might do? Anybody want to weigh in on that one?
I don't know that it's what they might do, but I think when I think about what you would hear if you're interacting with a transforming system, I think that the language and the conversation would be a lot more about, well, we versus I think that's a huge indicator for me about what I'm working with when I walk into teams. And I hear a lot of, well, I versus, well, we are moving in this direction.
That's a great one. So I should change that slide. It should say, what should you see or hear? Because, boy, that idea of talking about we, referring to us as we, is really a very big indicator that it is a transformed system. Absolutely. That one system, one role has as much right to think about or have an opinion on what somebody else does as the person who's in that role, that has as much right to give them advice and almost an expectation to give them advice as a person that's in that role. That is a transformed system, and that's a wonderful example. Now, I'm going to share with you before we leave, maybe today or maybe the next time we meet, that we have a set of modules that you can use on leading by convening. And they're self-study modules. And I hesitated to bring them up today because they are entirely education set. They break off in state and local, they break off to school age and early childhood. So I hesitated to use them today because every example is education. But when you said that, one of the examples there, if you know about education, one of the examples is from the California Teachers Union, which is a very powerful teacher union. There is a gentleman who was the special ed chair of the California Teachers Union, and he talks about that very situation. He talks about the moment when he felt like we were partners, that we had dropped some of our preconceived notions about what people were going to do and not going to do based on their role, and we started talking as we. So, that I might just share that one with you because it is so close to what you just articulated as an indicator, what would look to you as a transformed kind of system, that I think that that it would be appropriate. And I think if I can, was it Dana that said that? I think that was Dana that said that, right?
It was. Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. Yes, it was.
Yeah. So Dana, you may actually like it because it is an education context. Okay. I will share that with everybody. But that's this is been really the one of the foundational kind of pieces of this work is to really help people see the difference between shallow engagement and deep engagement, and for people to be reflective on that. Some of the activities we're going to do this afternoon will follow up on that. Whoops, got ahead of myself here. So you can see that you can create a rubric here. And in this particular rubric is one I copied from one the stakeholders did. This particular rubric is around implementing evidence-based practices. And so the operational decision was that you want to do this you want to select the practice with the constituents, because, you know, selecting a practice is a lot different than just telling somebody that here's the practice that we're going to implement. And you can see in this particular situation, they wanted to pay attention to the fact that you are really identifying and selecting the practice that will make a difference in not just from the point of the person that is leading that system, but from the point of the people that are expected to implement that practice. And so here is an example of what those stakeholders, when they were writing the rubric on selecting an evidence-based practice, here's what they thought they would see at those various levels of engagement, from shallow kinds of engagement, where you can see in the informing slide, they're just basically telling people, it's a presentation about here's the best evidence-based practice. As you move across then, you start to see that you're having an interchange, you're actually involving people in analyzing the problem, taking a look at the data, talking about what the structural changes are that might be needed, and then identify a practice after you do that. And then at the transforming level, that you continue to do that through implementation, that you're consistently reaching out to stakeholders to get continuous feedback on what's going wrong before it shows up in an evaluation. If you have this relationship with stakeholders, you get those early warning signs because you're connected to people that are doing the work. And it's not, you don't see them as just people that are complaining. You see them as people that are giving you information that you need to be aware of and react to. That's a transformed system from the stakeholder perspective. Okay, so we have a number of those rubrics for you to take a look at. I just copied pieces out of some of them to show you, how all this fits together. But one of the things that that we know is that, we got to find this commonality. Commonalities are what really brings people from various perspectives together. And it's not just one kind of commonality. It could be a commonality of need, that they require the similar resources, the similar data and skill sets. And you see that right now in terms of everybody having to switch so radically what they're doing to a at-home kind of work. There's a commonality of need. There's some potential there. And on one of the calls recently, we heard one of the local systems of care projects saying they finally have an opportunity that the schools are realizing that they really need to be attentive to the social emotional side of this work, in this particular kind of situation. And they're kind of seeing this as the opportunity for them to get some of the things that they have to offer into those kind of settings because they have a commonality of need. So there also is this commonality of purpose, that we're together around some kind of a particular set of goals and objectives, and I need you and you need me. I don't know much about you, you don't know much about me, but we can try to figure it out if we're going to actually achieve what we want to achieve. And then this idea that there's a commonality of action, that you realize that working together you can get someplace that neither of you can get alone. So we're going to try a tool here from Leading by Convening. And let me check the time. Yeah, we have time.
We have about 15 minutes.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a real quick introduction here. This is the most popular tool in Leading by Convening. We're going to do two of the other really popular ones this afternoon. Far and away, this is the most popular tool in Leading by Convening. If you looked at things that are submitted by just about, I can't even tell you the number of states, Leading by Convening is the thing that they say they're using to, 4 simple questions is the thing that they're using to do this. So 4 simple questions is really simple. It is, who cares about this issue and why? What work is underway separately? What new work could unite us? How can we deepen our connections? 4 really simple questions. This tool came out of trying to work on transition from school to community with youth in New Hampshire. That's where it came from. Totally, every one of these tools came out of a real situation. This is what they came up with. It is far and away the most popular tool. So we're going to try this out. And here's the breakout. Where is our scenario? Where's our scenario? Okay, so the scenario is this. And Mark, I think you have that scenario up on in the breakout. I don't know where it went to in here, but so the scenario is this: that a number of of our agencies have been thrown into working in virtual environments really quickly, and that recently a number of these stakeholders got together, and it's in your handouts. I don't know what happened to it here, but you have that scenario in your handouts. Ann's telling us that in the chat. But recently, a number of these stakeholders got together, and they started talking about this. So beyond this idea of access, that it was slow internet and those kinds of things, they started talking about other issues. They talked about this idea of telehealth and teletherapy that they were, a few months ago, they would not even consider doing, or they were not considering doing. Now was the order of the day, and they started to think about this idea that beyond just access, there was this idea of confidentiality. There was the access of privacy. Who else was in the room that they could not see? They had a number of issues that came up in terms of things that this switch may have an effect on the field forever. And so they started to think about how they needed to learn about this. And so we're going to go to a breakout, and we're going to do the 4 simple questions on that particular scenario. Half of you are going to take the first 2, half of you are going to take the second 2. We're going to come back and see what you had to say about using this tool in a situation that's right in front of us right now. Okay? All right, Mark, let's go to breakout.
Just 1 second, I have to stop sharing. Okay, so in just a minute, we'll go into a breakout room. Jamal will be in the one room, and he'll be focusing on 2 of the questions, and then I will help facilitate the other room. When we get in there, we're going to have about 5 minutes to kind of go over everything, and then we'll also look for either a note taker, or if that doesn't work, Jamal and I can also do that. And once we get in there, Jamal and I will also post the scenario in the breakout room as well as the 2 questions. And we're all back.
And we're back.
5 minutes was quick.
Yeah, that was quick. But this I don't know how the first group did, but we'll hear from them I don't know, Mark, who's going to report from your group on those first 2 of the 4 simple questions?
Sure, I can. And just looking at the time, we're at 11:30,
okay.
so some people have meetings or might have meetings. So who cares about this? We kind of came up with families and counselors, therapists, funding sources, so managed care and kind of the state people, the technology experts, and also talk about that community partners and agencies, from providers to like United Way, those kind of agencies. So really, when we think about all of the people that we talked about in the beginning, it really was many of that group. And then what might they already be doing? They had talked about kind of stepping into some emergency planning. So the idea of how does Comcast ramp up their internet relatively quickly, or the idea of looking at how things have been done for releases and signatures in the past, and to kind of figure that out, that they might already have some of those processes in place, or adapting current policies or procedures, or adapting current bulletins to kind of come into place. And then the other thing was, even just thinking about the technology piece, is from our mobile phone companies, the things that the providers did with making minutes unlimited for a certain amount of time. So just real quick kind of discussion on things that might already be happening.
That was quite a lot for 5 minutes. That was great. So Mark, if you wouldn't mind capturing that, and we'll put it together with what the group comes up with on Monday and share with those people on the community call, okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, Jamal, how about who's sharing out from the other group?
I was, and I know that we talked about a lot of the same things, but one of the things that we talked about is that with this group, there was already likely a shared language, and that when we think about the telehealth world, this is something that can be looked at more broadly to get suggestions and input from others at different levels. There is guidance documents out, so people who use telehealth frequently will know about that, whereas people who are just coming into this world necessarily don't, and how you can engage the staff and the agencies that are already doing health to develop more of a coaching model and pull in physical health to kind of tie the two together.
Wow. This was amazing for 5 minutes. Imagine the things that came out of here. I mean, some of these things really are excellent things for us to as we talk about carrying over concrete things. There is a group that wants to work on this. So some of the work that you just did in this session should go back to that group that is working on bringing up these issues and thinking about it together, thinking about how this all ties into the changes in some of the grant funding, the changes in a number of other things. So these conversations, even just this 5 minutes, doesn't end here. It's an ongoing opportunity to connect. Thank you so much. So Mark, I don't know, can you put that last poll up? Should we do it now, or do you want to do it when we come back? I know we're a couple minutes over.
Why don't we do it when we come back, and really try to honor that hour and a half for lunch. And have
Okay, that's fine.
Does that sound like a fair?
Yeah, that's fine with me. We'll do it as sort of we'll come back and take that quick true and false with key points from coalescing around issues as kind of a summary of what we've done and an introduction to where we're going. But please come back for the afternoon, because it's pretty packed with more activities like this one, more tools. I think you'll like it. Okay? I'll see you at 1 o'clock. All right.
1:58, and we will get started in just a couple of minutes. And Joanne, you should have, you've got the control already. Okay.
I have control? Okay, Mark.
So we'll
all
just
right,
go
let
back
me just
one.
check that.
Yep, and then we'll go back to one
I
slide.
do.
We're going to go backwards
Okay.
one for the true and false.
Okay. So I hope everybody got some emails done over that break time. The most important one came in like 3 minutes before we were ready to start this call. So I hope I actually answered it correctly and didn't make too many mistakes. All right. So Mark is going to put up a poll, and what I wanted to do before we leave that first habit of interaction, coalescing around an issue, I wanted to just do a quick check on how you're understanding this. Okay, so there are 5 statements about coalescing. So what do you think, true or false? From what you got from this morning's session, What do you think? True or false on these? We'll give you a minute to do that. Can people see all of them?
They should be able to scroll down.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a little scroll on the right-hand side.
Uh-huh.
Or you might be able to enlarge it across your whole screen as well. Maybe.
Oh, we've got quite a number of people answering. Not everybody yet, but give it a look and see what you think about these.
Yep, I think that's everybody that we have available. So.
Yeah. Okay, let's see what the thoughts are. So it seems to be pretty unanimous. So people were getting some of these core ideas this morning across the board. People are recognizing that the only false one here was number 2, the idea that new perspectives are not always helpful. Sometimes it's difficult, but that doesn't mean that in the end, if we work through it, it's not helpful. So thanks so much. Good job. So let's let me just click on this and see if it goes. Click again. All right, so let's take a look at this one. Like some feedback. Sorry. So let's just, rather than doing this poll on this one, let's just talk about it. So what I want to do is just ask you, from what we've been doing so far, how are we doing in terms of this balance between stopping and talking and doing the and just giving direct content? Does it feel about right to you? I got a couple of thumbs up, a couple of shaking heads. So okay, all right, we'll keep going the way we're going. Thanks a lot.
I can do the poll.
Okay, why don't we just take the poll real quick? So then we'll have it for our records. First one, more time to stop and talk. Time for talking is about right, or too much time spent talking. So it looks like, yeah, looks like we got the validation, the actual data on it. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you, Mark. All right. I'm going to click here and get going. So we're back to this idea of convening, and I want to really talk to you about convening because you get a lot of things now where people have substituted the word meeting with the word convening, and it seems to be, a lot of invitations you get, they're saying we're having a convening, and in many cases it is just a vocabulary change. There's nothing different than a meeting. They're just calling it convenings. And maybe they're paying a little bit of it more attention to the invitee list. But one of the things that we heard from the stakeholders when we were doing leading by convening was a nice invitee list is just that. It's a nice invitee list. It doesn't mean that anything's going to happen with that diverse group of invitees you might have invited. Doesn't even mean that they're really going to be interacting on site. So this idea of convening, we talk about it as being a new discipline. That there are things, as we saw in one of those earlier slides, it's a set of competencies, a set of behaviors, a set of skills that's both teachable and learnable. And so it constitutes a discipline that we're continuing to define. So, if you start using leading by convening and you start using these principles, you're going to help to define what that actually means in practice. And the reason I'm saying that is because what we've been trying to promote is this idea that you don't tell people what convening is, you co-create it with them. And so in this way, if you start incorporating these practices into your own practice, we can reshape some of this in Pennsylvania. We can recreate people's expectations for participation. We can help people see the difference, just like we were talking about before lunch, the difference between shallow engagement and deep engagement. And in doing that, we're forming this new discipline of convening, and we're doing it together. So the way we talk about this is that discipline is more than an invitation. It's more than a participant list. It's more than the meeting itself. It's the beginning of a relationship. And that's the fundamental piece of this discipline, that it is the beginning of something that you build together. Okay? Okay, let's go on to that next one. So when we talk about convening, we're talking about, oops, I don't know how I did that. First I can't get it to move, now I can't get it to stop. Okay, so when we talk about convening, we're talking about bringing the stakeholders together to do two things. To discuss why why an issue is important, and also to discover what we need to do to improve practice around that issue. It's a two-part kind of thing. It's not just an academic discussion. It's a discussion with follow-through to practice. That's why we call people that get together in around convening a community of practice. It's not a community of learning. It's not a professional learning community. It's a community of practice. The point is to change practice through your own interaction. You're co-creating a practice change. And through your own networks, you're deepening that practice change till it becomes accepted and becomes the way people do business. So when you're talking about a convening, the kind of things you hear at a convening are, you should hear more of from your perspective, in your experience. Those should be the kind of things that that really kind of bring us together, that provide that opportunity for people to share and create the issues around which they can do real work. So with that background, we're going to go on to this next habit of interaction, which is relevant participation. Okay? Let's take a look at relevant participation. Oops. Well, I don't know. My fingers must be really strong. I'm moving like multiple slides with one stroke. So relevant participation, ensuring relevant participation is the full habit of practice. And it focuses on both the right mix of stakeholders. Okay, so you saw when we did the first poll at the beginning of the day, we were looking for your roles, we were looking for the geographic spread, we were looking for diversity of role to identify your perspective. So that's the mix of stakeholders, constantly monitoring and being attentive to the extent to which you really have a mix of stakeholders. And if you don't, then knowing that some of the assumptions that you're going to make are informed by heavily by one group, one kind of mix of stakeholders, not the entire mix of stakeholders. So it's being intentional about what you do with the mix of stakeholders you have, inviting the right people, but always knowing whether you've really got a mix of stakeholders in the room before you decide that the conversation you're having is the right conversation to have, right? And then if it's not the right mix of stakeholders, understanding how you're going to take that conversation out to the fuller group to see if the conversation you've had is validated by that fuller group. Even in one of the breakouts, I heard them talking about that a group would find a way to check their conversation back with the fuller group. It came up even in that short amount of time that we had in the breakout. So people are seeing that just convening a group of people that you're comfortable with or are your immediate contacts is not the same thing with actually trying to convene for practice change. But the second thing about relevant participation is that when you're talking about relevant participation, you're thinking about the way people come into the activity, but helping them to actually become comfortable enough, participate frequently enough so that they are truly engaged, and gradually over time, they take increasingly deeper roles in leadership roles in that group, that they start identifying for themselves ways that they can contribute, ways that they can lead. So relevant participation is about inviting the right people, but it's helping them really take an active role. So I don't know what's going on here. We're moving. These are really moving, Mark. Can I go back one? Okay, there it is. So, we're talking about participation and engagement. So think about this a little bit. You heard me say that relevant participation has this dual purpose of both inviting and enabling engagement. So if you think about participating, think about some of the things that you join. You get an invitation, you join them, you accept the invitation, you attend the event, you share, you ask, on the calls, people, you're putting stuff in the chat, you're unmuting and expressing. That's participation. But engagement, real engagement, is when you do all of those things that you would do in participation, but you're really interacting with others, you're contributing, you may initiate, you stay connected, you're identifying the right level of participation for you, whether it's, monitoring the interest in what people are doing, or actively getting involved with people or with what people are doing. And if you do decide you want to get involved with that you try to find ways that things that you're comfortable. Maybe you start co-leading something with someone, then gradually work into some leadership roles in these groups or ways in which you contribute. But this idea of engagement is an increasingly deeper way of involving people. There's nothing wrong with participation, but real engagement is an ongoing process. It's a process that helps the person be more of a participant and less of a participant and more of a partner. And so that's how we're talking about relevant participation, okay? So let me just go on to this next one, because one of the things that we say is that, is there one, did I miss one in there, Mark?
First of all.
No? Okay. So relevant participation, if that slide is missing, relevant participation really has three phases. Yeah, you have frequency. For people to really get the right level of participation, you have to engage with them frequently. It can't be episodic. You can't have one kind of interaction, in January, and then you don't really have any kind of interaction with them till April or May. It's unlikely that they're going to ever be more than just a participant. They may come, they may, attend the events, they may actually, participate on a call or in a meeting, but to move past that, we need a regular kind of communication. We call it a rhythm of interaction. People have to know that you're going to interact with them regularly for them to really believe that you want them to be a partner. So frequency of interaction is a key one. The next one is the various roles that people take. If the same person is always the leader, if there's no opportunity for any kind of leadership levels, for any of those other roles, then it's hard for people to believe that you're really considering relevant participation. And the third thing that we have to consider about is the range. What's the range of stakeholders that you're involving? Are you really trying to find ways that multiple stakeholders can really find a way to truly participate? So these are the three phases of relevant participation, and each one of them is slightly different. But if you really examine those three, and I think you have it in your handouts if that slide is missing from here, but think about the way that slide identifies the things that you should be paying attention to as you think about relevant participation. So I'm going to go to this slide that's on the screen, and this slide that's on the screen. This particular tool called Engaging Everybody comes from the work to try to cross transition-age youth in education and health in Wisconsin. So they were trying to build this connection across the health and the transition age in mental health and education. So it was 3 agencies. And so in trying to do that, they kept inviting more people and more people and more people. And they were creating great participant lists, but every time they spent half the time going over what had just happened. So people were getting getting frustrated with it because it wasn't going anywhere. They were always communicating what happened instead of moving forward. And so they developed this tool. And quite honestly, this is the second most popular tool in leading by convening. Many people just call it the circle tool, and you can see why. But the way that they worked this out in Wisconsin was to identify levels of participation, and people could sign up for those levels of participation. And here's the way that they described those levels of participation. So the core team, were the kind of the nickname for them would be the doers, the doobies. They were the organizers. They organized people, they organized the activity. So they have to have enough content to be respected enough to be the core team. But they also have to be diverse enough so that they can reach out to the right people. So this core team, the makeup of this core team is really important if it's going to really move toward engagement, okay? The second team, the second circle there are the key participants or key advisors. Now, these will be the people that are the champions. They're not going to organize the meeting, but they are important to getting this work done. So let's say if you were doing something around children's mental health in Pennsylvania, you know, some of the people from OMSOS, some of the other divisions in the mental health agency, some of the national organizations, the state affiliates of national organizations that might be related to the issues that we're considering. These are people that have big connections out to people in the field, but they themselves are probably not going to be the core team. They're not going to be the organizers of things. And in many ways, you're depending on them to make the connections for you, because other than that, if they are the only person that represents their perspective or their group, then your interaction is one person deep. And one person deep isn't going to change practice. So these key participants and key advisors are very important because they have respected roles on the issue that you're talking about. They have connections to networks of people that are important to the work you're talking about, but they're more in the role of champions. They convey the importance of the topic. They invite people into participation, but you can't hang your hat on them really being the people that are going to do the change work. They're important for you to connect to those people, but you can't really depend that they are going to be the ones. If they're the only ones representing their key stakeholder group, it's unlikely you're going to get where you want to go. So let's move to this third network. This third one is the extended participants and the feedback networks. These are the people you got to reach. They're the ones at the practice or the family level. They're the people that get invited by those champions. So say you have a statewide family group. The person who's the executive director or lead project director is probably one of the key participants. But if that's the only person for that family group, it's probably not going to make much of a difference. The key here is to get that champion, that key advisor, to bring people from their networks actively into the work. Be the conduit to bring more people into the work, because we can't get to practice change unless we get a critical number of people actually making the change with us, okay? So this third circle is really a very important circle. And then this last circle, I want you to think about this last circle. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about the idea that some people, the difference between a stakeholder that is influenced by your decision or can influence the success of the decision you're making, those people have a certain degree of engagement, involvement in the issue because it's personal to them. When we're talking about this dissemination network, we're talking about people that have communication channels that, you know, if they're involved in the work, they can use their communication channels to send this information out to more people, to explain from the point of view of their stakeholders, use their networks, their communication channels to explain this issue to their stakeholders and invite them into the work. But the second piece of that is those that might have an interest in the issue, but they're not core to the work right now, but you want to still keep inviting them, asking them to put things in their newsletters for their constituents, asking them to give you things from that their constituents are writing about this issue. So these are the people that are stakeholders that have an interest in this, but they may not see themselves as critical to the issue right now. And when you truly think about looking at the this full range of participants in this way, including where are those communication links and where are those dissemination networks, you create this potential for people to maybe see themselves not so much as a key person to this. Maybe they start out as just a dissemination, in a dissemination role. But sooner or later, you keep sending them things. You keep involving them in your work. You keep sending the information to them. You send them updates on what you're doing. And sooner or later, many times, you hit something that is core to their work. And they move from those outer circles to those inner circles pretty quickly because they see that the work is important to the work that they're doing. So these are the ways that this tool helps you to think about that range of stakeholders and the kind of roles that stakeholders play. Okay? So let's go on to this next one. I want to show you one more thing on this before we go to the activity. So, two more things on this. Sorry. Oops. So let's go back to this one. Here it is. Okay, so this particular slide, I'm really trying to get you to think about these circles. So if you think about the way we talked about these circles, and if that core team of people that are really involved on the issue is in the center, and those people that are those that are important participants to represent different groups, if you leave the information there, if you leave the initiative there, it's not that you can't make progress, but it's not sustainable progress because you haven't had enough people involved. So one of the things that the stakeholders were really quite direct about was that too many initiatives fail because they don't get out of those inner two circles, and that to really get a breakthrough strategy, you really have to get out of those two center circles. You've got to get out to circles 3 and 4, because if you stay in circles 1 and 2, then your participants are limited. You're not very deep into the organizations that you need to engage. You have a few people that may have a deep connection to what you're doing, but it's not deep enough to get people to actually think about or change practice. So in your view, think about this statement that we make, that the breakthrough is in circles 3 and 4. So if you take that statement, what would that mean to you? I mean, how do you understand that concept of breakthrough being in circles 3 and 4? What do you think? Anybody want to take a guess on that one?
Is it that you have much more buy-in of the community at that point because you have truly extended to the stakeholders that are more likely to be directly impacted by the initiative?
Absolutely.
And such as family.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The idea that the breakthrough comes in 3 and 4 because you're trying to get a larger number of people. You're trying to reach out to people that form more of a critical mass. as long as it stays with a small group of people, it could be a wonderful initiative. But if it stays within a small group of people and it doesn't expand out to the people that really are doing the frontline work or are the intended beneficiaries, it's never going to be a breakthrough strategy. The breakthrough comes in, as Heifetz would say, you've given the work to the people. You're giving the work to them. You're doing it with them. They're telling you what the work has to look like, and you're creating that kind of relationship. So think about that concept of breakthrough. Think about how some of the things that we've talked about today lead you to have the skills and have the tools to actually reach large numbers of people. Think about how this tool helps you to identify the ways in which you can let people find the level of participation that's right for them. You can find a way that large numbers of people can be involved in your work, and yet you can keep it organized. You can keep it connected, okay? That's the point of this particular tool. Let me just go down here. All right, so let's take a look at this tool, this particular slide. The only thing that's added to this slide, let's go back one, is you see this white arrow here? So this arrow conveys this idea that across those circles, it's not a fixed boundary. In other words, the strength of any kind of a convening is this mix that you're not in that core team and that's the only thing you know. You're not in those key participants and you're just coming together with a few people and that's who you talk about. The idea of the strength of this tool is that you're able to think about providing multiple ways for people to participate, and you're developing the strategy so that you're keeping the learning that comes from each of those circles, you're sharing it across those circles. So a core team is always aware of, which of the key participants are opening up their networks, asking them, what do your stakeholders tell you about this? Sending things out routinely, and then actually showing them that you're using some of the information that comes from their networks. Sending things out to dissemination networks and asking, what's the response? What did your constituents say about this? What do they know about this that we're not covering? And that information always comes back across those networks. You're always defining ways that you could take what one of those circles knows and help the other people to learn about it. And that is, some of what we're going to talk about in terms of, what you can do to create those kinds of activities. We probably won't get to all of that today, but in our follow-up conversations, we're going to take a look at some tools that are very specific to that. What can you do to get people to create this kind of interaction across people that have different levels of interest, they have different levels of knowledge, they have different ways that they want to participate. How can you create those kind of activities that will draw people in? We're going to spend some time on that in one of these 2-hour follow-ups, okay? So the key to this, as you look at that two-way circle, it talks about that two-way arrow. It talks about a two-way learning. So, in terms of learning, how does this diagram actually speak to you about an organization that is a learning organization that learns from the activity of its members? What do you think? How does this kind of a diagram of an organization, how does it support learning? Anybody have any ideas?
I think it's sort of like the picture of the elephant that you showed earlier, that, we think we know, we've examined all the angles of it, but you send it back out to stakeholders and you find out, you were looking at the wrong angle or you forgot part of the elephant. So
Oh, Trish, that is a good example, really a good example of that. And that's exactly what we're talking about, because those stakeholders are, you're thinking about those stakeholders as being in one of those circles. You're creating ways that they can be connected to you, that they understand the connection to you. They understand that if you say you're going to be in that circle, here's how you predictably, I'm going to engage you. This is how you will always know what we're doing. This is how you will always be able to tell us what you know about what we should be doing. Absolutely. That's great. Wonderful. All right. So here's the slide I was looking for earlier. This kind of, to sum this up, that, you know, relevant participation has those three faces. And we have to really always keep looking at what that means. The range of stakeholders that we're engaging, the frequency with which we engage them, and the roles that we allow them to aspire to. So if we keep that in mind and we keep going back to that, it kind of keeps us on track in terms of relevant participation. So here's an example of relevant participation from one of the rubrics that the stakeholders did. And they took as the operational decisions, ensure relevant participation as an operational decision. In everything you do, ensure relevant participation. And they also took the task of translating work into ways that other people can participate. So if you take a look at this, it takes those two operational decisions, and in this rubric, you can follow it across to the deepening way that you can engage stakeholders in these key kinds of ways. And as you, as a leader, as a facilitator, can go back to your own behavior, and that's really what determines what's in that operational decisions category. These are things that you can change. You can change your behavior based on the way that your stakeholders tell you that your behavior falls into one of those columns, one of those cells. If this behavior was not changeable, then there'd be no point in seeking feedback from your stakeholders or measuring what your stakeholders, how they perceive what you're doing. But all these actions are changeable. And so in this way, having a rubric which you can use with your stakeholders, and they can give you feedback from their perspective on how well you're doing, allows you to be able to make those changes. So let's take a look. So we're going to be working with these rubrics, but I wanted you to see how they work in practice and how they are practical in terms of helping you stay on this engagement track. So we're going to go to a breakout again. And this particular breakout is a practice scenario, again, very timely, one that's in front of us right now. So let's take a look at it. So it's during this COVID-19 statewide stay-at-home restrictions, agencies quickly moved to telecommunication teletherapy. And in the first couple weeks, you could see that staff that had never done this, even a few months ago, now we're doing this every day. So they adjusted to the new system. And, some practitioners were on a call, some clinical and consumers were on a call recently, and they were saying that, in some cases, there was actually better participation, especially by children and youth. And then others reported that families had a lack of comfort with all the platforms that were being used online. And as that conversation deepened, they started to acknowledge that they knew that many of the providers were not using the same platforms, and actually they didn't know what other agencies and other telehealth providers were using. So as they thought about this from the consumer perspective, they started to wonder, as this practice grows, what are we asking our consumers to be able to do? Do we even know what education is asking, what platforms we're asking the same consumers to learn for education? We know that this is tough for our own staff. How can we kind of just be doing all this to consumers at the same time? So what I want you to do in this breakout is to use those circles, and let's give some advice to those people that are going to be convening around that problem. So when we go to breakout, what I want you to do is to take a look at the circles, and we sent those to you in a handout that you can use today. But in your breakout, I want you to take a look at this problem of, asking the consumers to use all these different platforms. And I want you to take a look at it from the mental health perspective. I want you to take a look at it from the consumer perspective. So who might be in each of those circles? This is kind of a pre-think activity. So you're thinking about if you're going to reach out and you're going to do something on this issue, you're sort of pre-thinking it. Who might be in that mix? Who might you have to reach out to? And how can you use those circles to define your strategy there? Okay? So if we're clear on that, Mark, are we going to go to breakout, and we'll take what? How long? We have about five or so minutes on that one?
It's up to you. How long do you think?
Well, we only had 5 on the other, and we got quite a lot done. This one's pretty straightforward. You're going to use those circles to identify who you think would be in that mix and what you might ask them to do.
So we'll do about 5 minutes. So we'll come back at right around probably about 2 after 2.
All right, that's good. We're going to do the breakout then, right?
Yes.
All right. Okay. An organization could be in one circle, but also have activities in the other circles. Oops, I think I'm out.
We got kicked out. I didn't even notice we were getting kicked out.
I am a timekeeper.
You are.
Well, somehow I missed the button even coming up saying we were about to get kicked out.
I know. I was like,
It was there. I didn't want to interrupt you all. Y'all were having such good conversation.
It was a good conversation, absolutely. So let's see, who was in breakout? Mark, were you in breakout 1?
Mm-hmm.
Want to tell us what the conversation was like there?
Sure. I mean, I would say, please, anybody from the group chime in. I think it took us a minute to kind of wrap our heads around the circles and really thinking about the core team, and then getting to the key participants and the extended. And I think one of the things that was really, I would say one of the key points was, so could the same title, let's say, be in multiple of the circles? And we said family, or even the student assistance program, something like that, where some would be in the dissemination because they're not totally involved, but then you have other maybe SAP parts that are really maybe in the driving factor because it's a little bit more key of interest, or they have that little additional knowledge, so they might be in towards that, either maybe the core or the key participants.
Yep.
So I think that was one of the challenges when we were thinking about it is I don't always like labeling people, because I think it can get a little bit confusing as to, well, do I stick with that label?
Yeah, yeah. And actually, really, we were kind of getting to that same spot in our conversation, that these organizations, they could fit in multiple. It's not that those roles are fixed. People can move in and out of those roles, based on the interest of their members, but different parts of their networks might want to have a role in different circles. And in that way, you're really making a kind of deep connection into some of those, especially family networks, some of those organizations that represent families. They have their own infrastructure. So some of the people in their main office may be in one role, whereas people in their leadership teams may be in another. and their editorial and newsletter people could be in another. So absolutely, that's really, that's a key point. That's excellent, actually. Great. And so Jamal, who was going to report out for us?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit. If anyone who was in our group, if I was missing anything or explained anything sort of unclear, please feel free to chime in and help me out. But we were thinking that the core team would be sort of like the state level agencies, and the MCOs would be sort of those who can help disseminate information. With the promoters being some of the people who are actually doing the work, like the licensed social workers and United Ways, using social media, local legislators. I know Ann was talking about some of those calls that they have, and they're actually disseminating some information and things of that nature. And then Shu says something with the insurance companies being those who, you know, how they do the mailings or those robot calls. And they just disseminate a lot of information and stay in touch with the people who they serve. So, and it was the conversation of kind of going back and forth with some of those things and with some of those people and could be in those roles, especially when it comes to family, being key participants and champions and moving into more of a dissemination role and being a promoter. So I think it was a lot of the same conversation that we had in our groups and trying to identify exactly who might fit where. I personally don't think it's a perfect box that you put people or groups
exactly
in. But it's like Joanne said, everybody can kind of move depending on who's taking the lead at what point in time. So
yeah, it's a way to bring some organization to a large number of people. It's a way to think about what large groups of people can do, but it's not like you're, you know, pinning a name tag or a number on somebody and said, that's where you belong, that's where you stay. It's a way of letting people, there's really two ways you can use these tools. You can kind of use it as a pre-think. So you're thinking about the task and you get a rough idea of people you don't want to forget. You're thinking about who might want to do what kind of things. And in that way, you get a kind of the landscape of the issue. That's one way to use that tool. But the other way is to explain what some of the ways that people, you know, might contribute and let people pick what role they see for themselves, you know? So there's really two ways to use a tool like that. Now, Ann made a really good point, and it's one that I brought up on the call, probably because we're both in education, and that is that, you know, we're not only are, you know, county clinicians and other telehealth kinds of providers like PT, OT, using these platforms, but right now education is using it for instruction. And so, you know, what are we asking these families to master? Would we be asking, in terms of a school district, to create that sensitivity that would you be asking your teachers to master 3 and 4 platforms? And are we actually asking those families to master 3 or 4 platforms? So it's a question of seeing this from the intended participant, the intended beneficiary, from their point of view. Absolutely, this is good. So I'm okay. So I'm not sure, Dana, do you want to unmute? And, you put something in there that I'm not sure. I might have missed the first part.
You missed the Ann's part. It's okay.
Yeah. It was
okay.
It was Dana that said it. So.
Okay. All right. That's fine. Okay. So let's see if we can. So we went through the breakout. So let's take a look here at relevant participation, and let's take a look at this true or false. So again, we have 6 things here that are really sort of the hallmarks of this idea of relevant participation. So let's see what you think. Are they true or false?
And
So we're going to see the results here.
Yep.
So let's see. For everything except, no, number 4, we had a little bit of difference of opinion. 1 and 4, some difference of opinion. So let's take a look at those two. When undertaking new work, keep the number of people small so that they can get work done sooner. What do you think? So some people thought that that was true and others thought it was false. So for those people that thought it was true, what was your logic on that one? Anybody want to tell us what they thought on that?
I didn't answer, but I think from my end, I think it's how I might read the question is, if I was thinking about the smaller group, I would think of that as the core.
Yeah.
And kind of those doers. That's how I would see it, as that smaller beginning group that are kind of centralizing the idea of where they want to go and then bringing the larger in. That's maybe where I would see it. But
so it might be that people that answered true were thinking about, you know, organizing that core group to organize the work, in which case I surely understand that response. But in general, the people that wrote false, anybody want to speak to that? Why you would think that you might want to go with a bigger group of people, or how this tool helps you to go with a bigger number of people? Anybody want to speak to that one?
So Joanne, I went back and forth.
Yeah.
I initially hit true and then changed it to false because, similar to what Mark just said, I was thinking the core group. And then when I read it again, I thought, no, in the beginning, you want more input, but then a core group comes from that. So that's why I ultimately ended up going with false. But I went back and forth a couple times on that one before I hit submit.
Yeah. And that's actually, Sherry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I've learned is that when you start too small, you actually don't have enough perspectives, and you might start down a path that isn't the right path at all once you get others involved. So I disagree that a small number of people, even though it might get the work started sooner, it might get it started in a way that's not helpful for later.
Absolutely. That's the actual point of this tool, that actually being able to involve a large number of people and find ways that they can tell you about the work, and this idea that you might start out in a broad way and then allow people to sort out the ways in which they want to participate, and then that kind of helps you to get that core group. And when you get a core group that's informed by the beginning of the work, informed at the beginning of the work, then you can make sure you got the right people that actually represent all the perspectives that you need to have there before, as Sherry's saying, you start down the wrong path. One of the things that the stakeholders, really said in terms of leading by convening, and last year I was working with a number of states to put together a state report on their progress, and part of that was reaching out to the stakeholders. And no matter which state I talked to, the people that were on those groups felt that they were involved as a second step, and they never forgot it. That they were not the outreach in the beginning. They were always a second step. Something was always formed before they had a chance to say something, and that they felt that their participation was like giving a pushback, was received as a pushback. And so that's the strength of a tool like this, to find a way that it's open enough, broad enough, you're not making any promises. Just as we started the session today, to say prepared but somewhat vulnerable, it's hard for leaders to do that, to come out and to say, I'm prepared to have this conversation with you, you know, I don't know if you're all expecting me to know all the answers. I can't know all the answers. I'm ready to have the conversation with you. A lot of leaders don't have 25 years of great stakeholder relationships to be that vulnerable with people. But in leading by convening, that's what the stakeholders told us they wanted. They wanted somebody that could come there prepared, that had information, but was open to listening to the way something should be shaped, and that they had some way to participate afterwards. And that's where that tool came from. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a way that that tool can be tweaked, but in actualizing their own experience, that's the tool they came up with. And you know, this Wisconsin experience seemed to resonate with people. More people kept, you know, going to that tool. And as I said, it's probably the second most popular, after 4 simple questions, the second most popular tool in leading by convening. And, you know, people just kind of nickname it the circle tool. So, you know, if you look around enough in some of your state documents, you're probably going to find it, because there's a lot of places that people are trying to apply that are trying to think about opening their own leadership practice. Not an easy thing, but if we're going to really think about engagement as strategy, it's the kind of skills we got to develop. So thank you so much for your participation in that. This was great. And, you know, we're going to make sure that we give Monica from the UPMC Center, Family and Youth Training Center, you know, she's heading up a lot of this work in terms of evaluation. And one of her groups wants to actually think about these kinds of things and get together on that. So all the work that you did on these particular tools is going to go to that group, because they're having this conversation around these issues of telecommunication, telehealth, teletherapy right now. So thanks so much for participating in that. Okay, so let's see, Mark, let's go on here. We've been going for almost an hour now, a little over an hour, I guess. So before we go on to doing work together, let's try that same sort of, you know, box breathing, all right? So just to kind of, I don't know if you need to stretch or whatever, but let's just take just a couple of breaths here before, a little change of pace before we get into this, this next habit of interaction. Let's do it, okay? We're going to do count of 2, inhale, hold, exhale 4 times, okay? 1, 2. So think about the new kinds of tools and the new ideas that are coming across and that we're talking about together. 3. Think about your own motivation to use some of these things in your own practice as we go forward. 4. Okay, maybe do a little stretch out in your chair, or stand up and, yeah, arms over your head. Bring your arms out to the side and out in front of you. Just a little bit, since we're in our chairs so long today. Great. Okay, so let's go on to this last habit of interaction, and then we're going to finish up with a little demonstration of a tool I think you'll be interested in, okay? So we're going on to this last habit of interaction, which is called doing the work together, all right? So the tools in this section of doing the work together are all about the ways in which you think about really creating this relationship, this partnership relationship. So one of the things that we really want to think about in terms of this particular habit of interaction is the extent to which you're being authentic in your engagement with people, whether they sincerely believe that you want to establish this kind of stakeholder relationship we outlined earlier. So the thing that's really important is for us to understand that people judge our sincerity by what we say and do. Everything that we're doing is in some way giving people the idea that we are either sincere about creating this kind of relationship or we're insincere about creating that relationship. So it's a result of what we do and what we fail to do. And I like to use this statement from Dr. William Perky. He has a framework called invitational education. And he makes this statement that really sticks with me, and I don't know how it sticks with you, but he says nothing is neutral. Everything you do either moves people toward you or away from you. So as we think about engagement, it's a good thing to remember that nothing we do is neutral. Everything we do gives a message to the stakeholders that we want to engage. Let's go on here. So a concept that we really try to promote is this idea of differentiating, managing, or engaging your stakeholders. That's a tough one for people to grasp. Many people confuse managing their stakeholders with engaging them. Planning a set of stakeholder activities without their involvement, looking at stakeholder engagement as something you have to do at a certain regularity on a calendar is not engaging your stakeholders. It's managing the stakeholders. So this difference between managing and engaging is a fine line, because the more stakeholders are managed, the less they're engaged. And the more they're engaged, the less you have to manage, because you're creating that relationship that we talked about in the beginning. You're developing the relationship that you desire with your stakeholders. So as long as you're thinking about stakeholders as a commodity to be managed, you're not anywhere near engagement. So over the course of this next couple of minutes, this particular piece of the time, think about this concept of engaging and managing in the activities that we're going to pursue, okay? Whoops, where'd it go? Back, sorry. Oh, here we are, okay. So, a quick poll here. I put up on the screen 10 ways that you might engage stakeholders, things that people typically say in their plans, things that people typically report in their reports. So what I want you to do is check off the kinds of things that you do or you're familiar with in terms of stakeholder engagement, things that you see as common ways that people engage stakeholders. And in fact, let's make it things that you do, okay? All right. So the most common ways that people were engaging, although somebody on this group has participated in every one of these, which is wonderful. But the most common ones from this group are email distribution lists, Facebook announcement of events, and online surveys. Okay, so of the experience, thinking of that as a common experience, if you think about the ways that you know your colleagues engage people, are those same three things fairly common in terms of the ways that your colleagues think about engaging stakeholders? Would you say that they're fairly common?
I think so. I think those are probably the easiest ways that people think to engage.
Yeah, it's actually, they're pretty straightforward. They're things that people are used to. And, you know, if we think about the ways that people actually reach out and engage, they're probably the most frequently chosen, certainly among this group and probably among your the colleagues that you work with as well. So what we're going to do in this next slide is to think about different ways to consider stakeholder engagement. Okay, so one of the ways that you can do that is to think about engagement in 4 quadrants, okay? So you see how I have this listed on the screen? Quadrant 1 is this, it's on 2, I should start with that. If you think about this, 4 quadrants formed by 2 axes. One axis goes across, and that is this axis as to how you're doing the work. Is this information and this engagement, does it come from you to them, or is it done with them? That's the first axis that we're looking at. And the second axis is whether this is formal, really in a formal way or an informal way. So when you put those 2 axes together, you get 4 quadrants, and it's pretty easy to take a look at the way that we engage stakeholders and to plot them in those 4 quadrants. So there's no magic answer, there's no magic number of things that have to be in each quadrant. The idea is that there would be a mix of activities in those quadrants. And let's see why. So the first quadrant is information that comes from you to the stakeholders, and it's in a formal kind of manner. So if that was the only way that stakeholders were engaged, you know, how much engagement could you really expect, right? So in quadrant 1, it's information out, basically. So you're sharing information, whether that's in training, whether that's in information that goes to them routinely, just straight, you know, newsletter kind of stuff. The second quadrant then moves that a little bit toward the side of doing it with. It's still formal, so it might be like, let's say, a webinar on an issue, but you might at the end of that webinar have some interaction with the stakeholders. You might create with them maybe a frequently asked question list after the webinar where there's some kind of, you know, participation. So it's still a very formal kind of process, but it moves slightly toward doing this with the stakeholders. It's almost like when we looked at the rubric, where the informing level would be quadrant 1, the networking level would be quadrant 2, right? So let's move up to the informal side. If you go to quadrant 3, we're talking about doing this with the stakeholders and doing it less formally, okay? So here's where we get into, you know, stakeholder developed webinars, stakeholder, you know, polls, frequent polls that you might, you know, have where stakeholders, you're doing a poll a week or something like that. You know, stakeholders are submitting questions and you're gaining information from the field by doing that kind of thing. Stakeholder developed blogs where people are, you know, commenting on, you know, blog posts, maybe some podcasts where, you know, you're doing those kind of things where you're interviewing stakeholders or they're talking about an issue, those kind of things. But it's less formal and you're doing it with your stakeholders. That's quadrant 3. And quadrant 4 is probably, you know, the one that we really have to work on the most, because quadrant 4 is the one where you're telling your stakeholders what you learned by doing the work with them. And you're also telling them what you avoided by doing the work with them. So this is that relationship kind of area, because it's in the formal quadrant. It's clearly something that the leader needs to do. It's on the informal side, but you know, you're doing it. It's from you to them, and you're sharing with them what you have learned by doing the work with them. So it's kind of closing the loop on all of this engagement stuff, because the point of it is to reassure the stakeholders that the engagement is real, and that means telling them what you've learned and asking them what they've learned. So you're kind of finding out what they learned over in quadrant 3. And in quadrant 4, you're telling them what you've learned by doing the work with them. So if you think about this, now I'm going to tell you just a little story about this. I did this with a bunch of stakeholders in Georgia, 3 school districts. And we were going to do this activity because the person that was working with them on their Project Aware grant was feeling that they just didn't get the sense of really engaging the stakeholders, right? So she asked me to do this tool with them. So before the meeting, I asked them to write down 10 things that they do with their stakeholders. And 2 of the districts came in with 10 things written down, and the other district came in with 33 things written down. And they were, I mean, they couldn't wait for this activity because they just thought they were going to shine, right? And they, I mean, the whole day, they said, when are we doing that activity? I was like, yeah, we're going to get to that. So people started sharing what they put on their list. And, you know, this one district had this 33 things listed on their list. And then I put up the quadrants. And it was so clear to them that everything they were doing was in quadrant 1. And their faces just dropped. And what they did at the end of that session was they blew this up. They blew this chart up, and they laminated it, and they put it in their office. And every time they're choosing an activity or planning an activity, they go and they plot where it would be first to make sure that when they're going through their activities, they have a mix of stakeholder kinds of stakeholder engagement. So as I'm saying, there's no right or wrong way. It's not like you have to have 2 in each quadrant. It's the fact that you're aware of the quadrants and that you're aware that there's different kinds of things that you could be doing with your stakeholders, and that you actually do more than the kinds of things that are in quadrant 1. Okay? All right. So let's go to
Joanne,
the pool. Yeah,
before
yeah,
you
Mark.
jump into that, can you kind of go a little bit in between? I'm trying to just really grasp on between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
What I heard was almost like you're getting with 2, you're sending out some information and you're getting, so how did that sit? Or how did that kind of come to pass, the information? Was it useful? Can you provide a little feedback or something of that nature? Mm-hmm. And what I heard with 3 was really the converse of it. Maybe in thinking about it, number 3 is more along the lines of a dialogue. So almost like, bad example, but almost a Facebook private group where they're sharing information that's maybe in a small, not out for the whole public to see, but a message board or something along that line where they can really kind of share information and get that more detailed response.
Absolutely right. And they can suggest to you that there are aspects of this issue that maybe you haven't covered. Maybe that's where you set something up like, let's set up a thing like that, and people are going to put in the questions that everybody needs to ask, right? And then you co-create with them a frequently asked questions that is stakeholder developed instead of frequently asked questions which is project developed or district developed or agency developed, right? It's a stakeholder developed set of frequently asked questions. Or let's say you do a webinar, instead of having just an expert webinar, that you co-create a webinar with your stakeholders so that they're involved in the development of that webinar, they're involved in selecting the presenters, they're involved in what the follow-up activity is after that. Absolutely. That's the difference between 2 and 3, you know? A straight webinar with follow-up afterwards and maybe some activity, that kind of is on the verge between 2 and 3. You know, the idea of feedback and what could be different, that's certainly, you know, a straight activity for number 2, pretty close to, if you're going to plot that on a scale, the almost over to the 1, it's just a little bit into 2. But you can have activities that are, just as you suggest, kind of like between 2 and 3. But the idea is that you're using these quadrants to help you see the extent to which your activity is engaging. that it's open to other people participating, that you're creating a meaningful way for individuals to have some kind of a role in the work that you want to do together. But well said, Mark. That was well said.
What I'm also thinking or hearing is quadrant one may be the right move for many people, because they just want that cursory knowledge. They don't want to be involved, but they just want to feel, hey, there's something out there. So it's really about the strategy of what you want back, kind of thing.
Absolutely. And there are many things that have to be quadrant one. When it is official guidance, it's got to be quadrant one, you know? I mean, it's got to start in quadrant one. Then, I mean, you can't come out with official guidance you can't start it in number 3. You may go to some follow-up activities to deepen the engagement over in quadrant 3, but you got to start formal guidance, regulation, legal, that has to start in 1, right? So it's not that there's not anything right or wrong with any of the quadrants. It's understanding that when you think about all your stakeholder engagement, you should be able to see a mix of those strategies. Does that help?
It does.
Good. Yeah, so this is an interesting one to try, and an interesting one to try to pursue with your own team. This is something that you could take immediately and use. Go to your own team and start thinking about some of the activities that you typically engage in, and where would you put your activities in this particular set of quadrants. So let's go to the poll and let's try. Go ahead, Mark.
And I'm going to put a little clarifying. I grabbed the wrong poll before. I actually grabbed the poll that we're supposed to do now. I grabbed that a minute ago. So this one, it says, which ones do you engage in? The actual question is which ones are in quadrant 1? So disregard the question, and we'll open it up.
Yeah. So think about those activities. Think about the ones that were most identified. Of all those activities that we have down there, how many of them would you put in quadrant 1? Remember, this is information out. How many of those are in quadrant 1? Not to say you couldn't develop them further, but as it stands, where would you put them?
You should have the poll in front of you.
Okay. So let's take a look at that. Most people identified, think about which ones we identified as the most highly used, and those first 2 were both pretty highly, came to the top. So email distribution and Facebook announcements were 2 of the ones that we said were most frequently used, and look where we put them. Almost everybody put them into quadrant 1. And it's certainly Facebook announcements could be developed in a way that they weren't straight information out, but it certainly most of the ways that, or many of the ways that Facebook is used is, information out, right? So let's take a look at some of these others. Conferences. Some people put that in quadrant 1 and other people don't think it belongs there. So how could a conference be in quadrant 1 and how could it not be in quadrant 1? What are you thinking about that? Anybody want to weigh in on how a conference weighs in on or fits in on this?
Joanne, this is Dana. I put a conference in 1 because I think a lot of conferences are information out only, and while you may go back and have conversations and learn from them, the goal of them is to have someone stand up and present, similar to a webinar delivered by experts, except in person.
Absolutely. It's not that conferences can't be something different. It's not that they can't create activity that people can pursue afterwards. And in fact, more than a couple years ago now, we took, how many people know the Pennsylvania Transition Conference? You're familiar with that? Anybody?
Yep.
It's held in the summer at Penn State. And one of the ways that we were trying to change that conference, in fact, they called that conference a community of practice. conference was that the idea that the training arm of Department of Ed Patton would hold sessions during that conference to understand better what people knew and what they didn't know about some of the critical issues, and then they would engage people over time to help develop some of those materials and report back the next year at how the stakeholders were involved in creating the training materials used at Patton. So you can see how that might take you through all those quadrants. The idea that it's a conference, so certainly you got the information out, that's one, straight information. Then you're opening up the opportunity for people to do something different with that information. You're creating the ongoing, that's number two, you're creating the ongoing way in which they would be involved and work with you. And in the end, you're going to come back the next year and tell them, here's how we improved this work because we did it with you, right? So that was a way that they were trying to change a conference to a community meeting. You know, I don't know the extent to which that still goes on, but it did go on for a couple years at least in terms of trying to operate in that way. So conferences can be different, but I think Dana's right. Most conferences we go to, it's one and done. You go, you get the information, you come home. And one of the things we're trying to do in the Pennsylvania Community of Practice is, well, if people were going to if they were actually going to the institutes, institutes this year in South Florida, or the South Florida Conference, you know, we were going to create a group of people that would sort of identify the key things that we didn't want to miss, and then people would attend that conference with the intention of coming back and doing learning labs around that material. That there would be designated participants in some of those conferences, and they would intentionally come back and share it with the whole group, and then we would do something with it around, you know, who wanted to go further on that issue, or if knowing about it was enough. But it was intentional about the way that we go to a conference. But I think that Dana's right. In most cases, conferences are quadrant one. They are just information out, although they don't have to be. And if we're going to think about convening as a way to go, one of the things we can do to get to that third circle, you know, this large numbers of participants that we need for practice change, is to think differently about conferences. That's how we can involve large numbers of people, whether they're involved with an organization or whether they're connected to a network that gets invited or not. It's our broad outreach to people that are in the field and inviting them into the work. So this is a way that we can think about some of the kinds of things that we typically do. And certainly, you know, from the responses here, you can pick out things that are quadrant one. And I think you can certainly pick out, you're kind of showing that you see how things can be moved beyond quadrant one. Okay, thank you. All right. So let's see. Let's go on here now. Oh, that was it. One more time. Okay. So doing work together, what does it look like? And this is a piece of a rubric again. And we're going to be using those rubrics in just a couple minutes, but I wanted you to see some of the rubrics that have been developed. And this one is the operational decision is communicate what is changing by doing the work with the stakeholders. So in other words, a leader would understand that the best way to communicate that they're changing and the system is changing is by engaging people in the work, to get them talking about how things are changing, right? So there are two behaviors here that they've identified. The first one is that you're communicating what's changing by doing the work with the people so that they take the information into their own networks that things are changing, that they become your allies, your advocates that we talked about in that relationship in the beginning. And the second one is that you are out there demonstrating. People can see you doing the work with your stakeholders. It becomes a brand, basically, of your work, that you're out there doing it with your stakeholders. So these are two of the behaviors that they talked about: being able to communicate and you know, share the idea that you're trying to change, and then actually do it so that people see you changing. And you can see that some of this, the gradations here in terms of depth, that these stakeholders described what you would see as that kind of participation deepens. Okay, and you have that on your handouts. And if you want me to send you the PowerPoint in full screen so you might be able to read it better, I'll be happy to do that too. Or Mark, we can send that out, right? Yeah. Okay. So you see how these rubrics work, right? And so now we're going to talk about using these rubrics for to really measure engagement. Now, you know, measuring engagement is a hard thing to do, and especially because so many of the reports that we create, the projects that we work on, they want some kind of qualitative way of expressing a difference. So it's easier, not easy, but easier to talk about engagement in a qualitative kind of sense. You know, describing behavior changes, describing the range of stakeholders involved, describing the depth of engagement using some of the language that's in those cells of those rubrics. So one of the things that we really wanted to do was to use these rubrics that we were creating to describe behavior to actually collect data on behavior change. Okay, so this data on engagement really has, you know, it's got a technical side, which, you know, a lot of people are good at capturing that technical side. How many times, how many participants, number counts, frequency counts, we're pretty good at that. But how do we capture the evidence of this adaptive side, the human side? And that's what we're going to explore using these rubrics that I've been showing you. Okay, so here's the tool, and you've got the live. You'll have the live link, but you've also got it as a download in both a PowerPoint and a PDF in the Leading by Convening blueprint that you got in preparation for this webinar. It's the one that says Leading by Convening 508 accessible. And so you can download any of this and use it either in a PDF or a PowerPoint formula. But let me just kind of run through with you, you know, how this might be, you might be able to use these rubrics to produce both qualitative descriptions and quantitative data, okay? So here's a rubric. And the book has got the book that you have, the one that says Blueprint 508, that's got 5 rubrics in it, and there are at least 5 more on the link that Jamal sent you about when he sent this information out. And if you need more of that, we're going to spend some time on all of this information in the follow-up sessions. But so you see what a rubric looks like. You see the operational decisions. You see the depth of engagement. Okay. So one of the things that you can do is if you're having in-person meetings, and if we're ever going to have in-person meetings again, which I assume we will someday, but one of the ways you can do that is to take these rubrics, and for about $20 at Staples, you can get this blown, you can get that rubric blown up 3 feet by 4 feet, and you can use dots. And you can actually, you know, take time and have people dotting and talking about their responses right there, you know, in a meeting. It's a really transparent way to do this. Some of the Project Aware grants pick this up, and a lot of them, you know, use this strategy of blowing up the rubrics and actually getting the stakeholders to dot, you know, where they thought they were in terms of the progress. So one of the things you can do is to, you know, do this in person with the dots. And then being able to debrief it is really important. So, what I would say for this picture here is that, most people feel that we're at a fairly kind of low level here, but some people feel that we're doing a little better than that. So what are some of the things that we might do to make everybody feel a little better about this, right? So there's no finger pointing. There's no, like I'm, a star in this group, or I've got connections in this group. None of that stuff that kills partnership. It's just a simple, straightforward, discussion out to the group. Some people feel we're doing a little better. What might we do to make everybody feel a little better? Okay. And, when you do it that way, people will tell you what they want you to do. So this is the first time you do the measurement. I tell people to use percentages because hopefully your number of participants responding is going to change over time. So your percentages will allow you to have that be valid over a changing number of participants, okay? So you capture the percentages, okay? So the next one is, a couple months later, with whatever frequency you set it up, you do the same, you grab that chart, you bring it out again, and you're charting in red this time. So people are seeing very concretely, they're seeing people think we're doing better, right? And again, you're saying, hey, seems like people think we're doing better. Some people really feel that we're starting to make some progress. What could we do to help everybody feel more that we're being more collaborative with them? What would you need us to do to feel more collaborative? And believe me, they'll tell you. So again, you're taking your percentages and you're keeping this data, and of course you know what comes next. You chart it again, this time in green, and they see, you can choose your own colors, but it's right on the wall. People believe they're making progress. They're seeing it right in front of them, that they and the other stakeholders think you're moving together on this issue. So here's a good one though, because you see that some people in the green are still back at, built back at the second level. So you don't hide from that. You say it right out. Most people think we're doing pretty good. In fact, some people are putting over here in the transformational column. So they believe they're changing their system. Not just they're changing, their system's changing. So can't wait to hear those stories. Well, I'm concerned that some people still don't feel, that we're making the change to, have everybody feel how they can be collaborative partners. What might we do now, given what we're doing now, the practices that we have in place, what needs to change to make everybody feel that way? And again, they'll tell you. And you know what comes next. You take your percentages and you start to collect your data over time. So now you have your qualitative measures because you're describing, each cell is describing a certain kind of behavior in the way you're interacting with your stakeholders. And secondly, these are stakeholder developed rubrics. So the range of stakeholders actually created these. Your stakeholders are monitoring their engagement on those rubrics, and you can use that language to describe the way your behavior's changing, their behavior's changing, their systems are changing in your reports, and you can back it up with some quantitative data in terms of actual data on stakeholder reported around engagement. So one of the things that we want to, that we always ask is, in the beginning, we started off today saying that engagement is strategy. Well, this gives you a way to show that engagement is strategy, because if engagement is strategy, your outcomes should be changing with your engagement. So if your engagement goes up, your outcomes should come up. You should see some difference in the way things are happening. You should see some difference in your fidelity measurement. You should see some difference in the way in which people are accessing information. The things that you're aiming for should change because of engagement. So what we're trying to do here is to show that engagement is not just a nice thing to do. It is strategy. It's a way to reach your goals, and it's in many ways it's stronger than some of the things that seem so much more fixed, have so much more structure to them. In many ways, engagement is actually a better strategy than some of those things, because it adds value to all those other things. It makes those things better. So if you can start to track, are your outcomes changing when your engagement changes? That's something substantial that you can say about your system. And and doing something like this will allow you to make those claims. So, you know, in this situation and in other situations, you're not going to always use that in-person kind of chart, but you can do the same thing with a SurveyMonkey. So you just type in what's in the cells of the rubric, and you have people do it in an online survey. You can still, you know, use the stakeholder developed descriptions of depth of engagement. You just type it into a SurveyMonkey. I have some of them already done if you want to use them. We were developing an online tool when the funding ran out, and what we were doing this with Framewells, who does all the educational materials for the patent system. So we were working with Framewell to develop this online tool. It's still underway, so you know, if we get some other funding, we might finish this one of these days. But the idea here was to create a tool that organizations, in our case it was states, could use to develop their own rubrics with their own stakeholders on a number of issues. And to do that, they would have to use the tool, they would have to have a validation that the work was being done with their stakeholders, that it wasn't just state staff writing, you know, something that matched their state plan, that the rubrics had to be stakeholder developed before they could be entered into the system. So we were trying to create this system, and it's the structure for it is underway. We need to finish it, but until we do, we can use this online tool to do that. And you can use any of the rubrics that we have. You can create your own. You could do what we intended to do with the online tool in a low-tech way and just, you know, create your own rubrics using the formats that I showed you, and be able to develop something like that for yourselves. So let's take a look at what the strength is of doing something like the online survey, because the online survey takes the operational definitions, and you see the operational definitions are right here, okay? The operational decisions, they're right there. Those are the things that we've said are important, and they're malleable. You can change any of those things. So because you can change them, the data on what people think you're doing is important. So here's your operational decisions, and here's your data on how well people think you're doing on each of those operational decisions. So this is, you know, made up data, so it could be a little bit more, spread out to show a little bit variation. But it shows you that the point of this is that stakeholder engagement is not one thing. It's not like a light switch that you either have it or you don't have it. It's malleable. It depends on these operational decisions, and it depends on that depth of engagement. And when you focus on those two things, you can change the way that you engage your stakeholders, and you can collect meaningful data on that. So that's the one on your behavior. The other one is your behavior over time. So one of them, these are two ways that you can display that data, and this one shows how you're doing in different time periods. So these are ways that you can see how the things that you can change the data, and how the data on engagement can change your outcomes. So this, we think it was a really important piece of work, because it's so hard to talk about engagement data. And it's hard to talk about engagement data that has both qualitative and quantitative aspects in other than frequency counts. So this gives you another way to think about that, and another way to both engage your stakeholders in collecting that data in an active way, and to produce something that you need to produce for your work as well. So I know that we're coming to the end of our time here together. Let me just check where we are. Pretty close here. So the idea is that sort of wrapping the whole thing up, that leading by convening asks you a couple serious questions. And the most serious of those is, how are we engaging stakeholders as allies in meeting our challenges? And it asks you to think about these kind of things that we typically rely on. It asks you to think about, is information enough? Is evidence-based practice enough? Is implementation fidelity enough? And lastly, it asks you, can you make sustainable progress without the active engagement of those at the practice and family levels? And those are the questions I want to leave you with, because if you can answer those questions, you can ask yourself those questions, I think those questions will lead you to think about the kind of things we've been discussing today, and the kind of things that we might be able to do together in the future. So I want to just see if there's any questions on anything that I covered in terms of these last couple habits of interaction, or on how you might use those rubrics. Any thoughts on that, or any questions from the group? No? Okay, well, it's late on a Friday, so I understand that. So let me just talk about what's going to happen next. We have 2 follow-through sessions scheduled. Each will be about 2 hours long. You signed up for one of them when you registered. And the way that we'll do that is that, you see, we've covered 3 tools and the rubrics in this session today. There are 21 tools in Leading by Convening that really fit into the kind of things that you want to do with your stakeholders. Every one of them was stakeholder developed. Every one of them was developed because we had to do something to meet a need or cross a boundary or engage a group. And they were all developed in response to the kind of things that you do in your work every day. So our next 2 sessions, we're going to take a look at some of these tools, and there are 2 other things that I want to introduce to you. A tool on really, fun tool that is really engaging in terms of using pictures to have people describe what their mental image of collaboration is. People love that when they'll do that one as long as you let them do it. So I hope you'll come to that one. I think we'll do that one on the next session. And then there's one in terms of generating assumptions, how you can learn what assumptions people are bringing to their work that they may not say, but they certainly hold when they come to your work. So those are 2 that are not in this list of tools, but were developed after this was printed. So for the next 2 sessions, we're going to take a look at scenarios, and we'll use these tools in practice scenarios that reflect the work that you're doing right now, the work that you have in front of you. If you send me ideas of scenarios, or if you just write a scenario that you'd like to have us use in one of these sessions, we'll do that. You signed up for one of these when you signed up for this session. So that is what we will be working on. After we finish these two follow-through sessions, we're going to offer some monthly peer coaching where people can submit something, and then other people that are trying to build engagement can come together, and we can sort of do a kind of a consultancy model where we give each other some peer support on what you might try. So we're going to do that monthly through September after these next two sessions. So that's, you know, pretty much the things that I wanted to share with you today. And I hope it's what you had in mind when you came to this call today. And I certainly hope that you join us for the follow-through sessions.
And we do have one more closing evaluation.
Huh? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. That's right, we do. Okay, so I'm sorry, Mark, I forgot about that one. So let me just do this. Now, how could I have forgotten this? So what I want you to do here, Mark's going to put this up, and you're going to rate it 1 to 10. So there are, I think, 6 behaviors that are in leading by convening, and so we're going to go through those, and you're going to, for each one, you'll rate the extent to which in your own practice you'd be motivated to really try to focus on this, focus on improving this behavior. So the first one we have here is meet people where they are. Let's see what you think about that one. Meet people where they are. Some of you I expect a lot of you think you do that already. And to what extent would you be motivated based on what we said to improve that? 1 to 10. Just give yourself a score.
So Joanne, how they'll do this is they'll actually probably answer all of them and then hit submit.
Okay.
So we won't be able to see until the very end.
Oh, okay. They're all up on the screen. I see.
Yeah, they'll all be
very good
up there. You just scroll down.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I see, Marcus. Just scroll down. That's good. Yep. We'll answer all of them. Just scroll down and answer all of them. There's only 6. And give yourself a score. To what extent are you motivated to use some of what we did today to improve your practice around this particular behavior?
And as you're kind of working through this, if you have any comments or just you can send it to me or you can send it to the group, just related to the training in general. We're trying to get some feedback on ways that we're doing this again on Monday, so that's always can be very helpful, including it was our first time using the breakout rooms. I think one of my initial thoughts is we probably need to give a couple more minutes than the 5 we had thought to really get people going. So I think that was one of my first thoughts. But if you have any comments on that, we would love to hear it. Or you can always shoot me an email, and I'll put my email in there. If you don't want to put it here, I'll put my email in the chat. We would always take any thoughts or feedback, because this is our first time doing this longer of a day piece, and we want to definitely make it meaningful and hear from you all as you feel. And
it's the first time we've ever done this virtually. This is a training that is a lot of talk at your tables, and then the idea of getting some of the big ideas out, that kind of thing. So it's a very different format to try to do this virtually. So we tried to put as much interaction as we could in terms of the things that are available to us on Zoom, the chat, the polls, the breakouts. But we're looking at some other software that allows to do more things, but it's not available right now. So this is using the technology that's typically available in these online platforms. How well did we do with it?
Joanne, I think we had everybody answer on the polls, so I think everybody seems to be fairly motivated.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at this. This is great. And the one that I'm really excited about is the one where we're talking about helping system leaders to be better about it. Where is it? Helping system leaders oh, here it is. to create more opportunities for authentic engagement. And as we go out from this kind of work, you know, the fact that we've had a core group of people like you on this call, and we'll have more on Monday, the idea that through the various ways that you got here, the various projects that you heard about this, through which you heard about this, we might be able to use the networks that you have to start that kind of engagement, to really engage with some system leaders and give them some ideas about, you know, how to do things differently. And look at the level of motivation people have for engaging in that way. To really use this as kind of a core group of really thinking about changing the way that we interact with our stakeholders. And when we say we're doing authentic engagement, that it is truly authentic, and that stakeholders have the idea that we consider them allies and we want to engage them. And if we miss the mark sometime, it's certainly not that we don't want to engage them, it's that we don't know how, and they have to come and partner with us to show us how to engage them. So that's the kind of lesson of leading by convening, and I was delighted to be with you today. I hope it was meaningful for you, sure was for me. And I'm going to use our interaction today to shape what we do on Monday. Thanks, everybody, for joining.